Pelican Valley is a beautiful, remote section of backcountry in Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming. Its meandering meadows and creeks and 360-degree view of the mountains make it appear like the perfect place to camp out under the stars. But unlike other areas of the park, Pelican Valley requires a special permit if you intend to stay the night. And before Yellowstone Park rangers give you this permit, they remind you that Pelican Valley is a very dangerous place. And in general, you should only be out there with groups of at least 4 people. On July 28, 1984, 25-year-old Brigitte Fredenhagen, along with her brother Andreas and her sister-in-law Janko, arrived at Yellowstone National Park. That night, they stayed in one of the park's more established campgrounds called Grant Village. The following day, they headed out to one of the park's famous hot springs called the Norris Geyser. That afternoon, before heading back to their campsite, they made a pit stop at the park ranger's office so Brigitte could apply for a Pelican Valley permit. Her plan was to spend the following night in the valley. When they went in the office, the rangers believed all 3 of them were applying for a permit, and so they weren't asking that many questions. They were just kind of going through the routine. And then when Brigitte said, no, it's just going to be me applying for a permit, they actually immediately tried to dissuade her and said, this is a really bad idea. Nobody goes into Pelican Valley on their own. But Brigitte assured them that she was an experienced camper, she understood the risks, and she still wanted to go on her own. And Andreas and Janko, who were standing behind her, kind of echoed that sentiment and said, no, she's really good. She knows what she's doing. The park rangers were not thrilled with her plan, but they ultimately decided, you know what, if she wants to go, she can go. They just asked her to show them on a map where she intended to camp, so if they needed to, they could come and check on her and make sure she was okay. And so she pointed to a section on the map, and they handed her her permit, and then she, along with Andreas and Janko, left the office and headed back to their campsite. The next morning, the trio got up early and they hopped in the car and drove to the Pelican Valley trailhead. They parked their car, they got out, and they began walking into Pelican Valley as a group. After a few miles, as planned, the group stopped, at which point Andreas told Brigitte that they were going to head back now and that they would meet her tomorrow at the trailhead where they parked the car. They said their goodbyes, and then Andreas and Janko turned around and started walking back towards the car, and Brigitte carried on into the wilderness. The following day, Andreas and Janko arrived at the trailhead to meet Brigitte, but she didn't show up. And after a couple of hours, they grew very concerned, so they called park rangers and asked them, have you seen Brigitte? And they said, no, but we'll go take a look. The area Brigitte had told park rangers she was going to be camping was inside of a densely forested area right next to a large meadow, which meant as park rangers came up to check on her, they would not actually be able to see her until they were practically right on top of her. So the park rangers made their way through the meadow and into the forest before they started yelling for Brigitte, but she didn't yell back, and then at some point they reached the area where she had said she was camping, and sure enough, they found her tent. But it was a very odd scene. When they came up to the tent, they could see there was a big tear in one side. When they poked their heads down and looked inside, all of her belongings in the tent were undisturbed. There was a foam sleeping mat right in the middle, and then to the right of the mat was a flashlight that had been turned off. On the left side of the pad was a tape player with headphones that she must have been listening to before bed. It had been left on until the batteries ran out. At the foot of the pad was her backpack, inside of which were all of her clothes that had been neatly packed inside of Ziploc bags to mask her scent. Also in the pack was a wilderness survival guide with a page flipped down that was a diagram of how to string your food up into the trees so no animals can get to it. The rangers looked around the backside of the tent about 2 meters away, and they found her sleeping bag perfectly flat on the ground as if it had been laid out to dry in the sun. But upon closer inspection, they found it had 2 puncture marks, one that was up near the neck of the bag and the other that was near the torso, but there was no blood on the bag. At this point, rangers started to speculate that this could have been an animal attack, but they were confused at the general tidiness of the scene. Typically, when an animal attacks a person, it looks like a bomb went off in the area where the attack occurred, and this campsite was very, very neat. As the rangers continued to walk around the campsite looking for clues and yelling out for Brigitte, they found a barely discernible drag tail a couple of meters away from the sleeping bag that was leading west into the forest and up a hill. And so the rangers started following this trail, and they got about 20 meters away from the camp when they discovered Brigitte's cooler lying on the ground on its side, and whatever food had been in there was now gone. There was some string laying next to it, so it looked like it had been strung up in the trees, but someone or something had gotten it down. From the cooler, the rangers continued walking along this drag trail another 20 meters or so up a hill where they discover a woman's sweater on the ground that's been torn up and there's blood on it. So at this point, the Rangers get their rifles up and they keep walking another 40 meters up and over the hill down into this clearing in the woods where they find Brigitte, or what was left of her. No one knows exactly what happened to Brigitte, but the theory based on physical evidence is this. After setting up her campsite, Brigitte climbed inside of her tent, got inside of her sleeping bag, and then put her headphones on to listen to music. A little while later, a male grizzly bear discovered Brigitte's cooler strung up in the trees about 20 meters away. And apparently, Brigitte did not string it high enough because the bear was able to reach up and pull it down. After the bear ate the food inside of the cooler, it was still hungry, so it began looking around the area for more to eat. It's believed this bear was so accustomed to human traffic in the area that when he stumbled across Brigitte's tent, he wasn't scared. In fact, he thought, there's food inside of there. There's people I can eat. So this bear quietly lumbers over to the side of the tent. It reaches up and cuts the nylon with its paw, and then it puts its head inside and bites down on Brigitte's skull and begins dragging her away. There was no sign of a struggle in or near the tent, indicating that Brigitte was most likely asleep, or maybe she just could not hear the bear because she still had her headphones in. She was dragged 80 meters by her skull to that clearing where she was consumed. An attack like this is exactly the reason why Pelican Bay is considered so dangerous, because it's full of grizzly bears. And even though grizzly attacks on humans are incredibly rare, most people do not understand just how horrific they are when they do occur. Grizzly bears don't really try to kill their prey before they eat them. Instead, they focus on pinning them down and then getting them under their body weight so they can't go anywhere, at which point they can eat them at a leisurely pace. Some say grizzlies actually prefer to eat their prey while they're still living, which is why so often in grizzly attacks you see the arms and legs eaten first and then the head and torso. This is a method that keeps the victim alive a little bit longer. Unfortunately, there was so little left of Brigitte that investigators could not pinpoint a time of death. However, because this bear broke normal behavior and intentionally targeted a human, there's a good chance he savored that meal. On April 28, 2000, a 24-year-old named Yuri Lipsky was standing in front of a cafe in Dahab, Egypt, overlooking the Red Sea. He had traveled all the way to the Sinai Peninsula from Moscow in order to film himself swimming through the Arch, but now it was looking like that probably wasn't going to happen. The Arch is an 85-foot-long underwater tunnel that connects a massive sinkhole right on Dahab's shoreline called the Blue Hole to the Red Sea. To get to the Arch, you need to enter the Blue Hole directly and descend straight down 181 feet, where you'll reach the top of the tunnel on the northeast side. But there's a catch. If on your descent you happen to miss the ceiling of this arch, which apparently it's pretty easy to do, you run the risk of going too deep. Now, going too deep does not mean you're going to miss the tunnel altogether. The arch actually starts at 181 feet, but then goes all the way down to 393 feet. So it's a huge, huge opening. The risk of going too deep has to do with how your body responds to the type of gas you're breathing. For those who are unfamiliar with diving, generally speaking, you have two types of dives. There's recreational diving, where you breathe the same air that you breathe on the surface. They literally jam air directly into scuba bottles. You breathe that and you go down to 130 feet. That's the recommended bottom depth that you would go down breathing regular air. And then there is technical diving, where you breathe a special mixture of gases. Typically, it's going to be a mixture of helium, nitrogen, and oxygen that allow you to go below 130 feet. This type of diving is exponentially more dangerous and requires all sorts of additional training. Because the minimum depth you would need to go to in order to access the arch is 181 feet, that puts you well in the technical diving range, which means you should be diving mixed gas and have special training and equipment. But year after year, people try to dive down to the arch and go through it on regular air. And year after year, people die doing it. When your body absorbs too much nitrogen, you can get something called nitrogen narcosis, which is a lot like being drunk. And in extreme cases, divers who get this have been known to remove their mouthpiece and inhale water, believing they are actually on the surface. Below 130 feet, your body absorbs nitrogen much faster, and regular air is a whopping 78% nitrogen. So the risk of getting nitrogen narcosis is exponentially higher if you're breathing regular air below 130 feet. Also, oxygen can become toxic the deeper you go in the water column. It can lead to black blackouts and convulsions that if you don't have someone there to literally physically move you up in the water column, you won't recover from it and you'll die. Regular air contains 21% oxygen, which is a lot of oxygen. So if you're diving regular air below 130 feet, you are at an increased risk of developing O2 toxicity. Now, to be clear, it is possible on regular air to dive down to 181 feet and make it through the arch and come out the other side and be just fine. But you're realistically at 181 feet pushing the absolute boundary of what you can get away with on regular air. Below 200 feet, you're probably dead. So if you're attempting to swim through the arch on regular air, you need to be paying very close attention to your depth as you descend so that you don't miss the arch and accidentally drift down below 181 feet to the very deadly 200 feet and beyond. So earlier in the day, Yuri had gone down to the edge of the blue hole and he had found one of the diving instructors that taught inside the blue hole. His name was Tarek Omar, and he asked him if he'd be willing to take him down to the arch to help him film himself going through the arch. And Tarek said, yes, but I need to train you for 2 weeks before you're going to be considered qualified to do that. And you need a special setup with a special gas mixture to do this dive. And Yuri was like, well, I'm leaving in 2 days to head back to Moscow, so I need to do this dive now. Is there any way you can do it today or tomorrow even? And Tarek was like, no, that's not how this works. And Tarek understood this more than anybody else, because in addition to teaching diving at the blue hole, Tarek's job was to dive down to the bottom and retrieve the dead bodies of inexperienced or overconfident divers that attempted the archway and didn't make it. Although there is not an official body count of how many people have perished inside of the blue hole, locals believe it's as high as 200 people just in the last decade. After Tarek was unwilling to take him without properly training him and outfitting him with the right equipment, Yuri thanked him and went on to a couple different other diving instructors with the same request. Will you take me in the next couple of days? And they all said, no, we need to train you and you need special equipment. And so finally, after no one was willing to do this, Yuri just left. Later that day, owners of cafes that overlooked the blue hole remember seeing a young man who was by himself walk to the edge of the blue hole. He puts on all of his scuba gear, he puts on a helmet and then straps a big camera to the top and ratchets it down. And then after he's got all his stuff on, he jumps into the blue hole and he disappears. That man was Yuri. A few days later, Yuri's family back home in Moscow did not see him get off the flight he was supposed to be on, and they reported him missing. Tarek Omar was contacted to go down into the blue hole and see if Yuri was down there. Tarek hopped in the blue hole, he went to the bottom, and sure enough, lying face down at the bottom was Yuri. When they brought Yuri to the surface, they realized his camera had been running the whole time, and he had actually filmed his final moments. Yuri's final video exists online, so you can watch it for yourself, but here is a description of what happens. After situating his camera on his head just the way he wanted it, he hit record, and then he jumped into the water. It was determined later on that Yuri was breathing regular air out of his tanks. The camera submerges under the water, and then Yuri begins to sink very quickly into the blue hole. But his breathing seems normal, and he's not thrashing around, so it seems like it's a controlled descent. But at some point, you hear Yuri trying to activate his buoyancy compensator. Basically, it's this life jacket, to describe it simply, that sits on your gear that you have a demand valve where you can inflate and deflate the air into it to neutralize your buoyancy. Or in an emergency situation, you can fully inflate it and stop yourself from sinking. In fact, you'll rise to the surface. But he's trying to activate his buoyancy compensator to slow down his descent, and the air is escaping his compensator. There's a leak and he can't slow down his descent. Now, Yuri was wearing a weight belt, which is very common in diving. In fact, I don't really know of all that many dives that you wouldn't use a weight belt. And any diver knows that there is a quick release function on your weight belt. Specifically, if you're in an uncontrolled descent or if you're in an emergency situation and need to get to the surface, you can jettison your weight belt and go to the surface. But Yuri was panicking and he was fixated on his buoyancy compensator that he was desperately trying to activate, and it was failing. And so he's not going for his weight belt. And then he rockets past the entrance to the arch. So he goes below 181 feet, he goes below 200 feet, and he goes all the way to the bottom where he hits the bottom at 392 feet. And then he begins to slide because the bottom of the blue hole was actually at an angle, and that archway went all the way to the bottom of the hole. And if you slipped out of the blue hole, it was a sheer drop off for thousands of feet. And you see on camera, Yuri rolls over and he's desperately clawing into the mud to stop himself from sliding out of the blue hole to definite death. And he's trying to get himself to stop, and finally he anchors himself in the dirt. And it's calm for a second, and he's kind of looking around. It's very clear he's confused, and then it goes still. And it's believed at this point he either removed his mouthpiece because of nitrogen narcosis, he pulled it out and inhaled water, or he was dealing with O2 toxicity and he blacked out and the mouthpiece came out. But either way, he drowned. On April 25th, 2003, Ralston takes a trip to Utah where he plans to explore the Canyonlands National Park. He slept in his truck that night, and the next morning at about 9:15 a.m. he gets up, and it's this beautiful Saturday morning. He hops on his bike and he bikes 15 miles to Blue John Canyon. The canyon was an 11-mile gorge that at certain places was as narrow as 3 feet across. And so Aaron locks up his bike and he begins walking through this canyon. About 6 hours later at 2:45 p.m., Aaron is right at this section of the gorge that's getting really, really narrow, and below him is about 100 feet down to the bottom of the desert floor. He was going to walk with both feet on either wall because it was so narrow and kind of Spider-Man his way through this section of the canyon. But as he began that maneuver, a huge 800-pound boulder became dislodged above him, and it comes tumbling down, and he barely gets out of the way, but it lands on his arm, and it pins his arm against the wall, and he can't move, and he's suspended 100 feet off the ground, and he's 20 miles away from the nearest paved road. Immediately, he tries to pull his hand free and push the rock off, but it's not going anywhere. And that's when it dawns on him that he didn't tell anybody he was going to be in this gorge today. No one knows he's here, and he's so far away from anyone that can help him, and he doesn't have a cell phone, he doesn't have a radio, he's got no way to communicate with anyone who could potentially help him. Now, the position he was in was not him dangling by his arm 100 feet off the ground. He was able to position himself against the rocks where he wasn't dangling. He was able to sit fairly comfortably besides his arm being crushed, and he was able to use the rock that actually had pinned him there as a sort of table or something to lean up against. And after he calms down a little bit, after a few minutes, he reaches back and he pulls his bag out in front and he starts taking inventory of what he has. And all he had was 12 ounces of water, so just a single water bottle, and he had 2 burritos and some candy bar crumbs. That was all he had. In terms of tools, all he had was this crummy multi-tool, and it did have a little knife that extended off the end, and almost immediately he takes that multi-tool and begins chopping away at this boulder to try to see if he can maybe crack it and push half of it off. But he's finding out very quickly that it's completely futile. It is not moving. It is an enormous boulder. It's not going anywhere. He cannot possibly break it with this crappy little multi-tool. As the sun began to set, Aaron started thinking really seriously about trying to cut his arm off. But again, all he has is this multi-tool and this crappy little dull knife, and he's thinking there's no way I can cut through my arm. There's bone in there. I can't possibly saw through the bone. And so very disheartened, he puts his multi-tool away and he begins to nurse the water and slowly eat the food and thinks maybe some miracle will happen where over the next couple of days, someone will be within earshot. I can yell to them and they can come get me, or maybe someone will see me when they're hiking overhead. I can just wait it out. But by the 5th day, he had run out of water. He was becoming delirious. He was actually drinking his own urine at this point, and he expected to die overnight. And so with his multi-tool, he etched his name into the rock, and then underneath it, he etched the date he expected to die, which was the next day. And then after that, he put his multi-tool down, and he did have a camera with limited battery, and he pulled that out, and selfie style, he filmed goodbyes to his family.
My name's Aaron Ralston. My parents are Donna and Larry Ralston of Englewood, Colorado. Whoever finds this, please make an attempt to get it to them. Be sure of it. I would appreciate it.
After he was done filming, he put the camera away and he leaned up against the rock and fully expected to die. But he starts to have this really intense dream where he sees himself playing with a child and he's missing his right arm. And he takes that as a sign that he's supposed to chop his arm off and get out of here alive and go start a family. And so he wakes up from this dream and suddenly all he wants to do is survive. And he looks at his arm, which is already starting to decompose at this point, and he thinks to himself, I know I can't cut through bone, but what if I'm able to break my arm clean through? I can take this blade and cut through the break in the bone. And so he began testing using the edge of the rock as a fulcrum to see if he'd be able to break his arm, using the torque of pushing it over the edge of the rock. And when he started to sense it was possible, he took a deep breath and then he broke his arm, takes his multi-tool, and over the next hour, he would painstakingly saw through his entire arm. Once his arm was free, he couldn't believe it. He actually smiled when he saw his arm still pinned underneath the rock because of his sheer will to live at this point. And high on adrenaline, he climbed the 65 feet out of this canyon with his one arm. He gets to the trail and he runs 6 miles, and he happens to run into a group of hikers. They give him food and water, and they're totally alarmed by him, but they're happy to help him. They call 911 and medics arrive and they save Aaron's life. Following Aaron Ralston's rescue, they went back to retrieve his arm, but in order to move that boulder, they had to bring out 13 park rangers, a hydraulic jack, and a winch, and all this heavy equipment, and they were barely able to move it. And they told Aaron, had you still been in place, there's no way we could have placed the equipment without killing you. So basically, you had to cut your arm off in order to get out of there. There was no other way out. And so for Aaron, I'm sure that felt pretty good to feel like you cut your arm off and that was the right decision. They would take his arm and they would cremate it and give the ashes to Aaron. And Aaron, after having his cremated arm for a couple of days, decided, no, I need to put this where it belongs. And so Aaron went back out to the canyon where he had been trapped, and he scattered his ashes over the boulder that had nearly killed him. In 2010, Aaron's ordeal was turned into a huge blockbuster movie called 127 Hours, where James Franco plays Aaron Ralston in the movie, and it's an incredible movie, albeit it's pretty hard to watch. Aaron Ralston himself said the movie, although it's a drama, is pretty much a documentary because James Franco does an incredible job portraying his emotions and what it was actually like to be trapped underneath this boulder for 5 days. On the evening of October 28th, 2006, in a Florida city called Port Richey, a 37-year-old woman named Marisa Weber walked in the front door of her home and called out a greeting to her mom. Her mom didn't call back, but Marisa could hear her in the kitchen making dinner, and so Marisa walked over to say hello. But Marisa only got about 2 feet into the family's very cramped living room when one of their many cats came bombing into the room and nearly knocked Marisa over as it ran past her and ran up to the side of the wall and just stopped and stared at the baseboard of the wall like there was something there. Marisa was totally annoyed by this cat, and as she looked over at it, she knew what it was doing, because lately Marisa had noticed there were clearly rats in her family's home, kind of scurrying around in the ceilings and the walls. Marisa could hear them all the time, and one of their cats was now clearly hunting one of these rats. And this totally stressed Marisa out. She'd actually begun taking anti-anxiety and antidepressant medication largely because of this rat infestation, and really just the fact that Marisa hated living at her parents' home, but she didn't really have the means to go out and live in her own place, which she knew would solve the problem, and so she was just kind of stuck here. And so Marisa turned away from the cat and likely the rat behind the wall, and she made her way through the tight little living room into the kitchen, and she gave her mom a quick hug, and she saw her dad was also in the room as well, and he said hello to her. And then Marisa's mom offered her some food, but Marisa said, you know what, I'm not hungry, thank you, I'm just tired, I'm gonna go to bed. And so Marisa again gave her mom a hug, she said goodnight to her dad, and then she turned, walked up the stairs, and made her way to her bedroom. She went inside and shut the door. The next morning, Marisa's parents got up and they began making breakfast and getting ready for the day, but Marisa did not come downstairs, and so the parents assumed she must have left early for her job. Marisa was a secretary at a waste disposal company. And so the parents just had their breakfast and they too went out for their jobs. And then in the evening, when the parents were back home, Marisa did not come home at the time she normally would after work. But the parents were not actually that concerned right then, because they figured, okay, well maybe she left early and she came home from work early, and so we just kind of missed her on both ends, and that's why her door to her bedroom is shut. She's just come home early and she's in there and she wants to be left alone. After all, she's a 37-year-old woman. She probably wants her space. But later that night, when still the parents had not even heard their daughter moving around up there, the mother went upstairs and knocked on Marisa's bedroom door. But there was no answer. And so finally, Marisa's mom opened the door and the room was totally empty. Now, at this point, the parents did start to get concerned because they're thinking, okay, well, we didn't see her this morning, we haven't seen her now, we don't know where she is. But again, their daughter is 37 years old, and if she wanted to go do something out of the house by herself and not tell anyone, she was kind of entitled to do that. And so the parents ultimately decided that they would just let this go for now, and in the morning, they were sure to see her. But the next morning, the parents still had not heard from Marisa, she had not come home, and now they were officially starting to panic. In particular, the mother was worried that Marisa might have been kidnapped or something going to or coming back from work, because Marisa was only 5'3" tall and maybe 100 pounds, so she was really small. And so Marisa's mom called her other daughter, Gina, in a total panic, saying, your sister, she's missing, we don't know where she is, she might have gotten kidnapped, come over and help us figure out what's going on. And so Gina came over to the house, and when she came inside, she told her parents, let's stay calm here. Marisa, she's 37, I'm sure she's fine. Let's search the house and see if there's some note or something from Marisa explaining where she is and what she's doing. And so the family searched the whole house, starting with Marisa's room, but they couldn't find anything that gave them any clues about what happened to Marisa. But they did eventually find Marisa's purse that was still in her room, and when they opened it up, they saw her wallet was still inside. And so that sent up a huge red flag for the family. They're thinking, why would Marisa go anywhere for an extended period of time without her wallet? That made no sense. And so at this point, the family did call the police, and they reported Marisa missing. But the police got nowhere on the case, and so on November 9th, so 12 days after Marisa had said goodnight to her parents, gone up to her room, and then vanished, the family was at a total loss for what to do. But Gina, Marisa's sister, had begun to think to herself, hey, it's possible that Marisa, who was not doing well mentally, she was very unhappy, she was totally stressed out about this rat infestation, which really highlighted the fact that she was stuck at home with her parents at 37 years old. Gina's thinking that it was totally possible that Marisa had just abruptly run away, or worse, maybe she had harmed herself. And so on November 9th, Gina decided she would take one more pass through the family home and just see if she could find any little indication that would give away what was going through Marisa's mind before she vanished. And where Gina started was in Marisa's room. And so Marisa, she went upstairs, down the hall, she opened up her sister's bedroom, and she walked inside, and you gotta picture this space. It was totally cluttered, almost like a hoarder's space. There were piles of clothes that were taller than a human person. I mean, this room is totally packed with stuff. But Gina, she took her time kind of walking through the room, looking everywhere, kind of sifting through all the piles of junk and clothes and everything in the room, and she couldn't find anything. But then at some point, her attention was drawn to her sister's bookshelf. And she looked over at it, and she thought she saw something odd right in the middle of the shelf. Now, Gina had a flashlight with her, and even though the light was on in the room, she still lifted up the flashlight and turned it on and shined it at this thing in the middle of the bookcase. And when she saw it, she screamed. Based on Gina's discovery, here is what happened to Marisa Weber on October 28th, 2006, the night she disappeared. That night, Marisa had come home, she saw her mom and dad in the kitchen, she was offered food, she turned it down and said, I'm tired, I'm going to bed. She went upstairs, she went into her room, closed the door, and sat down on her bed. Then Marisa grabbed a pill bottle next to her bed, which contained morphine and codeine, which are two very powerful painkillers. They're opiates, so highly addictive. She popped a few of those, and then she rolled a marijuana joint and smoked that, and then she grabbed the TV remote and sat back on her bed getting ready to zone out. But when she tried to turn on the TV, which was sitting on this bureau on the other side of the room, it didn't turn on. And right away, Marisa knew that the TV likely had become unplugged. This was something that happened periodically. The room was so packed with stuff that sometimes when Marisa was just navigating through her room, the stuff would bump into the bureau, and that would in turn jostle loose the plug from the TV. But the TV was actually not plugged in right behind where this bureau was. The TV was sitting on the bureau, but the plug ran down and kind of to the side of the bureau behind this huge bookcase that was pressed right up against the bureau. But this bookcase was so loaded down with books and things that Marisa had collected over the years that not only could you not really reach through the bookcase to the wall, but it was too heavy. You couldn't move the bookcase. And so the only way to access this plug from the TV was to climb on top of the bureau where the TV was and kind of reach back and grab the plug behind the bookcase and plug it back in. And so Marissa, who was likely beginning to feel the effects of all the drugs she had taken, climbed on top of this bureau, and she reached back behind the 6-foot-tall bookcase, and she began trying to grab the plug, but it was just out of reach. And so she leaned farther and farther and farther until she finally grabbed the plug, but when she managed to plug it back into the wall, she slipped forward and fell headfirst into this tiny space behind the bookshelf and the wall, and she got pinned upside down. Now, we don't know why Marissa didn't begin calling out for help. Perhaps she was so under the influence of these drugs that she couldn't really process the situation and didn't know what she should do. Or maybe she was embarrassed about the fact that she had somehow gotten trapped upside down behind her bookcase. But either way, she didn't call out for help right away. And unfortunately, what happens when a human body is trapped upside down long enough is all the blood rushes to the upper part of your body. It causes your eyes eventually to pop out of your head. It feels like your head's going to explode. But the real problem is all that blood pools around your lungs and restricts your lungs and makes it really hard to breathe. And critically, if you can't take a big breath in, you can't project your voice loud enough to call out for help. And so Marissa did not call out for help during those first critical few moments she was trapped behind the bookcase. And then when she realized she absolutely couldn't move, she didn't have the lung capacity to call out for help. And so likely for 1 or maybe even 2 days, Marissa remained upside down behind this bookshelf and likely was aware of her family coming in and out of her bedroom looking for her, but she was not able to vocalize. She could not get their attention. And so eventually she died. Marissa's family would say when they were looking for Marissa in her bedroom while she was dying behind the bookcase, they said they did hear sounds, but it sounded like the rats that were running all over their house. And so they didn't know it was actually likely Marissa moving around behind the bookcase trying to get their attention because she can't use her voice. And then after Marissa died, her family did continue to go back into her room to look for her, and they began to smell something funny, which was Marissa decomposing. But the family didn't know that, and they chalked it up to the fact that the room was really messy. And again, there are rats in this house. I mean, this was not a clean space. And so they kind of thought, okay, the smell can't be anything serious. It wasn't until November 9th when Marissa's sister, Gina, was back in Marissa's bedroom, and she looked over at the bookcase and she saw something strange. What she saw was her sister's foot right behind the bookcase. Gina couldn't really process it, so she got her flashlight out, she shined it on the foot, and when she scanned from the foot down, she realized it was her sister. On the morning of June 25th, 2007, a 28-year-old man named Mike Barnett woke up to the sound of pounding rain on the roof of his home, which was located in Hull, which is a city in northern England. Mike groaned as he rolled out of bed. It had been raining like this for the past month, and he and the rest of the people in Hull were just totally over it. But another reason he groaned is he knew that he would have to go to his job at a tropical fish store, even though he was not scheduled to work that day. There was a street right behind the tropical fish store that always completely flooded out from all these debris getting clogged in the drain, and the owner of the tropical fish store, so Mike's boss, who was an elderly guy, he would always go out and try to clear the debris himself, and Mike just knew, he really needed help, and today he knew his boss would be out there, and so he just felt like it was his responsibility to go in and help him clear out the debris. So Mike got dressed, he had some breakfast, and then as quietly as he could, he slipped out the front door. Mike was careful not to make too much noise because he didn't want to wake his dad, who he lived with. Mike and his dad had always been very close, but after the death of Mike's mother, he and his father had become even closer, and so they actually really enjoyed living together. But Mike also knew that his dad was very protective of him and very likely would not like the idea of Mike going out in this horrible storm to go try to clear debris in a flooded out street. It just was too dangerous. And Mike just didn't want to deal with that right now, and so he was able to slip out without waking up his dad. Mike hopped in his car and he drove to the fish store, and as soon as he got there, he hopped out, he went around to the back side of the shop, and sure enough, the entire street out back was totally flooded. Clearly, debris had blocked the drainage system. Now, Mike's boss was not out there yet. Mike could see him inside the shop, kind of going about his morning. And so Mike, without even going inside, just began wading into the water to begin clearing debris. The drain that was clogged by all this debris was located just off to the side of the sidewalk. It was down in a culvert. And so Mike very carefully walked off that sidewalk into this very cold, muddy water, and he began moving in the direction of where he knew the drain was. And so as he's walking, the water is down to his ankles, maybe up to his knees at some point, but he gets closer and closer to where he knows this drainage is down in this culvert. And suddenly Mike begins feeling this unbelievable suction at his feet that began pulling him basically straight down. Mike tried to move, but his feet were anchored to the ground, and then before long, he began getting pulled forward towards this drain, and then down he went. And as he went all the way down to his neck in the water, he felt this unbelievable pain in his thigh. Mike didn't know it, but his leg had been sucked through the drainage gate that was all blocked up. There was still some holes in it, and so his leg had gone through one of those holes, and it had pulled him all the way up to the top of his thigh and brutally snapped his leg in the process. And so Mike is in blinding pain from his leg being shattered and run through this grate, and he's literally up to his neck in this frigid water, and the wind's blowing and it's raining and the water's going in his mouth. And so Mike begins to panic and he's trying to pull himself out. He can't, and then he begins screaming for help. And at that moment, the owner of the fish store, who was still inside the store, looked out the window and he saw Mike flailing around. And instinctively, the owner could tell just from the panicked look on Mike's face that whatever was happening to him was an emergency. And so the owner just picked up the phone, called the police, and after telling them what was happening, the owner ran out to Mike. When the first police officers arrived on the scene, Mike was still in the water up to his neck, and the shop owner was right next to him. And the police officers, they assessed the situation in front of them, and they thought, okay, clearly this guy, Mike, is trapped in the water. This is serious, but we can pull him out. That's the obvious solution here. And so the two officers walked up to Mike, they waded through the water and got on either side of him, kind of pushing the shop owner out of the way. And then the two officers grabbed Mike's shoulders. These are strong police officers, and they began pulling on Mike. And as soon as they did, Mike let out this unbelievably loud scream of just pure agony. And in fact, his scream was so guttural that the two officers let go and were kind of startled by it. And very quickly, these officers realized this situation is far worse than it appears. Because not only is this guy totally stuck and he can't be moved, but, they're looking around and the rain is still coming down and it's clear the water is still slowly rising. And because Mike's body was situated over the grate, he himself was causing even more blockage, increasing how much the street was flooding. Meaning the officers knew they had to get Mike out as soon as possible or he would drown. But over the next several hours, more police officers, firefighters, EMTs, Good Samaritans, everybody showed up on the scene, and there were so many attempts to get Mike out of the water, ranging from trying to cut the grate, but the water was too muddy so nobody could see through it, and the water was so strong that nobody could set the bolt cutters on the actual grate. And then at one point they even tied a winch around Mike and tried to pull him out with a Land Rover, but every intervention failed. The rushing water that was pinning Mike to this grate was so strong, and Mike's pain in his leg was so high, it made it nearly impossible to move him. And so finally, at the 4-hour mark that Mike has been trapped in this water, a decision was made amongst all the first responders to amputate. So the police called a doctor who was willing to perform the leg amputation. And then after doing it, Mike could sense something was up. Clearly it's not going well. And he began frantically asking the police and all the first responders, when are you going to get me out of here? When are you going to get me out of here? And they just kept telling him, soon, Mike, hold on. It's going to be okay. Meanwhile, the owner of the shop at this point had called Mike's dad to tell him what was going on. And so as all these people are waiting for this doctor to show up to cut Mike's leg off, Mike's father shows up and basically barrels through the crowd and starts screaming, "I'll get my son out of here." But as soon as he saw his son, he was totally taken aback. Mike was up to his chin in water. There was a diver behind him in the water with him, holding him up, barely keeping his head above the water. Mike's face was totally pale and his eyes were totally unfocused, and he had this weird blank expression like he wasn't even there. And then a second later, a whole wall of police came running up to Mike's dad to stop him from getting any closer, and they told Mike's father they were doing everything they could to try to get his son out, and for now, they told him he just needed to go home. And so even though Mike's dad did not want to abandon his son, he could tell with all these police standing there in front of him, there was no way he was going to be able to go up there with his son. And so he would turn around and head back home without even speaking to his son. And then, when Mike's dad got home, he turned on the news, and the news was showing live coverage of his son trapped in that grate. And just a couple of minutes later, Mike's dad would watch his son die on the news. By the time that doctor arrived with that special saw to cut off Mike's leg, it was already too late. Mike had passed away from hypothermia. On Monday, June 21st, 2004, 72-year-old Jane Thompson drove her car down a road through the city of Laguna Niguel, California. She was on her way home from a weekend trip to Los Angeles, which was about 50 miles north of Laguna Niguel. And because LA was so chaotic and full of activity and constant stimulation, Jane actually really appreciated this commute back home, this 50-mile drive. It was a time to be by herself and sort of decompress from being in the city. So Jane used to live in Los Angeles, where she had worked for decades in the film industry. But she had retired and moved to Laguna Niguel 7 years earlier. And this move had been like a total lifestyle change for Jane, because her career in LA had been fast-paced and exciting. She'd been an assistant to some really important people in Hollywood, and then also she was an award-winning producer, and then a decorator for various Hollywood celebrities. It was sort of very glamorous what she was doing. So even though Jane was generally a pretty quiet person who appreciated her alone time, like driving in the car right now, it still had actually been really hard to completely transition to the slow pace of life outside the glitz and glamour of Hollywood, especially because her girlfriend, Marion Reese, still lived in LA. Jane had known Marion for decades at this point. They'd started out as coworkers because Marion owned a production company and Jane had produced a lot of projects for her. Then at some point years ago, their relationship turned from a, working friendship into a full-blown romance, and they'd been involved ever since. And even though now they lived over an hour's drive apart, they still spent a lot of time together. Jane was actually going back to LA again on Friday because they had tickets to the opera, and then also Marion was going to be joining Jane on a cruise to Europe the following week. But for right now, Jane just kind of looked out her window as she drove by a cluster of houses. And she noticed outside one of those houses, she saw her friend, Mary Larkin, gardening in her front yard. Jane had known Mary for years, and she was really Jane's closest friend in town. They'd spent countless nights talking and drinking wine together, sometimes with Mary's other next-door neighbor, Karen, who had also become a close friend. So, naturally, Jane slowed down in her car, and she rolled down her window, and she called out to Mary to say hello, and to remind her that they were due for a wine night sometime soon, before she left for her cruise. And Mary, after hearing this, nodded enthusiastically and said she would for sure give Jane a call. After that, the two women said their goodbyes, and then Jane kept on driving. And a few minutes later, Jane saw her condo complex's entrance up ahead, and so she threw on her blinker and turned in. And pretty soon, she was surrounded by mostly identical units with orange-tiled roofs that were all packed really close together. But Jane loved her neighborhood. It was on this quiet hillside and less than 4 miles from the ocean, and she just felt completely comfortable there. It was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked, and everybody seemed so warm and welcoming. And this meant a lot to Jane, because she didn't have any kids or living relatives. She was kind of on her own. So it was nice to feel like her neighbors were all looking out for her. As Jane pulled her car into the garage and got out, she looked across the street and saw her teenage neighbor, Sam Nelson, playing basketball in his driveway. Jane tried to get his attention and waved to him just to say hi, but when he looked over and saw her doing that, he kind of put his head down and quickly rushed inside his home. And Jane, she understood why. Clearly, he was embarrassed. So Sam was kind of a troubled kid. He had actually broken into Jane's house just this past Friday while she was out, and he took some of her jewelry. But he wasn't as clever as he thought he was, and Jane had quickly figured out it was him. So before leaving for her recent LA trip, she'd confronted him about it and told him to never do it again, and he was obviously mortified. But she had also told Sam that, she was not going to call the police here. After all, Sam was 15 years old, and he had just made a really dumb mistake. And in Jane's mind, Sam was a part of her beloved community, and so even though he had done something bad to her, she still wanted to look out for him. Plus, really, he hadn't taken anything that was particularly valuable or anything she really cared about, so she felt like she was just giving him a second chance, and this was no big deal. Now, Sam was obviously very appreciative at the time after realizing he was, not going to get in any real trouble here. But it was also clear now that he really didn't want anything to do with Jane. I mean, he was just embarrassed at the sight of her waving to him. But, for Jane, she figured maybe that was just as well. And so, after seeing Sam disappear into his house, Jane just shrugged, turned around, and headed inside her own house. Jane spent the next few days doing things around town, volunteering at the library and taking walks with her weekly walking group. And before she knew it, it was almost time to head back to LA. On Thursday evening, June 24th, so the night before she was set to go to LA, Jane stood in her kitchen making some pasta and thinking about what outfit she was going to wear for the opera in LA the next night. And then after she cooked and ate her dinner, she laid on the couch to watch some TV. Now, she had planned to only watch a little bit and then get some packing done, but pretty quickly she felt her eyelids get heavy, and soon she was fast asleep. 3 days later, on Sunday afternoon, Jane's friend and neighbor, Mary Larkin, the woman she had seen when she was driving home from LA, drove up to Jane's house with their other friend, Karen Hamara, and they jumped right out of the car. Mary had an undeniable knot in her stomach, which had only been getting tighter by the minute ever since Jane's girlfriend, Marion Reese, had called earlier to say that Jane had never showed up in LA for their trip to the opera, and now she was not answering her phone. And when she heard this, Mary immediately became very worried because, Jane just didn't flake on people without calling. And so given Jane's age, it seemed entirely possible that maybe she had an accident or medical emergency at home and needed help, and that's why nobody could get in touch with her. So after she herself tried calling Jane a few times, but with no luck, Mary had gone over to her neighbor Karen's house and asked her if she would come with her to go to Jane's house, just to make sure Jane was okay. And on their drive over, Mary had convinced herself, despite that feeling in her gut, that, everything would be okay. But now, as she went up Jane's driveway, she could see there were a few newspapers piled up at the end of it, which made her even more anxious that something was wrong here. And so Mary hurried right up the driveway, went to the front door, and began knocking. But as she and Karen stood there, they couldn't hear anything inside the house. Nobody was coming to the door. And so finally they left the porch and went around to the back of Jane's house to try her back door. And when the two women got into Jane's backyard, Mary froze because she could see the sliding glass door that led into Jane's living room was clearly wide open. And so Mary and Karen, from right there in the yard, just began yelling through the open door for Jane, but there was no answer. Eventually, Karen began to walk towards the open door like she was going to go inside, but Mary instinctively grabbed her and just said, "Don't." She was shaking and could barely think straight, but Mary felt like they just should not go in there, that it was not safe. And so instead, the two women ultimately backed away and went to go call the police. A few minutes later, Mary and Karen stood out on the street in front of Jane's house, watching as a police cruiser pulled up. The women immediately went over to the two deputies that got out, and they tried to explain the situation, that their friend was not responding to phone calls and that their back door was wide open, which just seemed really strange, and nobody knows what's going on. And so the officers asked Mary and Karen to take them to the back of the house where this open door was, and so they walked around the side yard, they went back there, and when they got there, Mary watched as one of the officers just walked up to the open door and stuck his head inside and began to look around. And as soon as he did that, Mary could see his body began to tense up, like he had seen something inside. Mary blurted out like, "Hey, what's going on? What's wrong?" But the officer, looking in the home, he didn't respond. Instead, he turned to his partner and told him to secure the scene and call for backup. There was someone inside, and he could already tell they were deceased. Hiring sounds simple until you have to do it. First, you're waiting for the right people to apply, and then you're sorting through resumes, trying to figure out who's actually qualified. And then after that, it's emails, it's scheduling, and a lot of back and forth. And before you know it, it's turned into a full-time job on top of your actual job. Well, the future of hiring looks much brighter because ZipRecruiter's latest tools and features help speed up finding the right people for your roles. so you save valuable time. And now you can try ZipRecruiter for free at ziprecruiter.com/Ballen. Over 320,000 new resumes are added to ZipRecruiter monthly, so you can easily find and connect with qualified candidates in minutes and unlock their contact info instantly. Use ZipRecruiter and save time hiring. 4 out of 5 employers who post on ZipRecruiter get a quality candidate within the first day. And if you go to ziprecruiter.com/Ballen right now, you can try it for free. Again, that's ziprecruiter.com/Ballen. ZipRecruiter, the smartest way to hire. Just about an hour later, at around 6 p.m. on June 27, 2004, Detective Daniel Salcedo stopped his cruiser in front of a condo in Laguna Niguel, California. Dispatch hadn't told him much, just that an older woman had been found dead in her condo. When Salcedo got out of his car, he could see that there was police tape all over the condo's front door and the driveway. And just inside the perimeter, there was an officer speaking to 2 women who were crying and seemed very visibly upset. Dozens of other officers and crime scene technicians were also scattered around the area collecting evidence. And one deputy saw Salcedo and hurried over to give him an update. So the deceased woman had been identified as the owner of the condo, 72-year-old Jane Thompson. And at first glance, it very much appeared like she had been attacked. She had been murdered. Her 2 friends, the 2 women who were very upset talking to police, had called the police for a wellness check, and the officers who responded had found Jane lying in the living room. They'd been able to get through her sliding back door because the door was already open. Salcedo glanced back over at the 2 women in the driveway who were still talking to the police, and Salcedo told the deputy to make sure they stuck around because after he took a look inside, he wanted to speak to them as well. As the deputy hurried off to do what he was told, Salcedo walked around to the back of the house, and when he got there, he saw that not only was the sliding door open, but there really weren't any signs of forced entry around it, which could mean that it had been left unlocked, or that maybe Jane knew her attacker and let them in. And so Salcedo stepped inside the condo. And right away, he saw there were all these technicians all over the place working hard to gather evidence and process the scene. And also what he saw was blood spatter all over the walls and all over the furniture. And then when he looked down at the floor, he saw Jane's body. She was lying face down between her couch and coffee table with a large pool of blood around her head. Salcedo crouched down next to her to get a better look, and he saw her wounds were just brutal. Her head had been so badly pulverized that Salcedo could not only see her skull, the actual bone, but he could actually see the breaks in her skull. Her skull was shattered. Now, Salcedo would have to wait for the autopsy to be sure, but to Salcedo, it was very clear that somebody must have beaten this woman with some kind of heavy object over and over and over again. A couple of minutes later, Salcedo stood back up. Based on the extent of Jane's wounds, it seemed pretty obvious to him that this was a frenzied, rage-filled attack, and that it likely had happened really quickly, or maybe, the attack happened in such a way that Jane was completely caught off guard. Because aside from the awful trauma to Jane's head, Jane didn't appear to have really any other wounds. So it didn't seem like she tried to fight back or defend herself. And aside from the blood spatter, the room around her didn't show any signs of a struggle. It's like she just got destroyed right here and blood went everywhere. Salcedo left Jane's body and searched the rest of her condo. He went in her bedroom, searched her closets, went in the office, went in her kitchen, but there were no signs of anybody ransacking the condo. There was no obvious theft that had taken place, at least at first glance. There were expensive electronics that were still out and not claimed. So to Salcedo, at least right now, he was pretty sure this was not a robbery gone wrong. As he wrapped up his initial walkthrough of the condo, an officer called Salcedo back into the kitchen. And when Salcedo went over, he saw the officer was standing by the landline's answering machine. The officer told Salcedo there were a bunch of new messages on there, and they started the morning of Friday, June 25th. Now, Salcedo was very excited to hear that because that gave them something of a timeline to work off of. Because if Jane had stopped answering her phone by, Friday morning, then that means she could have died maybe overnight on that Thursday the 24th, or maybe even in the morning before that first message came through on the 25th. At least that would be the latest she could have died based on the message. So Salcedo told the officer to be sure to log the tape into evidence. Then Salcedo went back to the living room where Jane's body was and all the texts were, And he just stood there with his arms crossed, thinking about, what's he gonna do next? Considering the attack had all the signs of being highly emotional, Salcedo felt confident that Jane's killer was someone who knew her and was deeply angry with her. So the first people he wanted to speak to were those that Jane was closest to, like family, friends, or maybe even romantic partners. Jane appeared to live alone, so he hoped other people in the neighborhood, or maybe those two women who called the police, could tell him more about Jane's personal life, her relationships, and give him a place to start. So Salcedo grabbed a few officers, and they headed outside to begin asking some questions. When he got outside, Salcedo could see there was now an audience of people, a crowd of, who Salcedo assumed were residents of this complex that were gathered at the edge of the police perimeter. And Salcedo understood why. Brutal homicides like this one rarely happened in this area, if ever. There was probably going to be a lot of panic and rumors in this community because of it. And based on the literal layout of this complex, the fact that all these condos are basically on top of each other, he knew that, those rumors would likely spread really quickly. But also, the fact these condos were tightly packed together gave Salcedo an advantage. Very likely because people are living on top of each other, somebody might have heard or seen something that could help break this case wide open. Just then, another police cruiser pulled up in front of the house, and a detective named Brian Sutton stepped out of the car. And when Salcedo saw who it was, he immediately felt relieved. Salcedo worked extremely well with Detective Sutton, and interviews were sort of like their specialty. As a duo, they had an instinct for asking the right questions that got people talking. So Salcedo hurried over to Sutton and quickly told him everything he'd learned so far. And once Sutton was up to speed, they went right over to the two women who had called 911. Salcedo was eager to interview them as witnesses, but he also was not ruling out the idea that they could also be suspects. He was sure this had to be a personal crime, and they clearly had some kind of relationship with Jane since they'd come over to check on her. When Salcedo reached the women, he could tell they had calmed down quite a bit from when he had first seen them when he first arrived. And the women, they were composed enough to tell him their names, Mary and Karen. They then explained that they were good friends with Jane and they'd come over to check on her. Because recently, Mary had gotten a call from Jane's girlfriend, Marion Reese, who lived in LA, and Marion had been worried because Jane had not shown up in LA for plans they had, and so she was trying to find out where she was she okay? And so Mary and Karen had gone to see if she was okay. This made Salcedo immediately perk up, and he asked Mary for Marion's information. As he jotted down Marion's phone number, Sutton asked the two women where they were on the night of the 24th or early morning of the 25th. So that was 2 nights ago and then also yesterday morning. And both of them said they had alibis. Now, the detectives would have to confirm their alibis because anybody can make up an alibi. But for right now, Salcedo was comfortable ruling Mary and Karen out as suspects. They both seemed genuinely stunned by Jane's murder. And while it did seem like they were good friends with Jane, he wasn't sure they had the kind of intense closeness that might have led to such a vicious attack. So he told the two women they could go home. And then Salcedo nodded to Sutton, and the two of them left the women and headed towards the crowd of neighbors to ask some more questions. The next morning, Monday, June 28th, and Salcedo was behind the wheel of his cruiser with Sutton in the passenger seat. They were almost at the end of their long drive up to Los Angeles to interview Jane's girlfriend, Marion Reese. Salcedo was eager to get her statement, because right now, they didn't have that many other leads. The forensics team hadn't found any DNA or fingerprints at the scene to test against future suspects. And the canvas of Jane's condo complex the night before really hadn't yielded much either. They'd learned that no one had seen Jane since Thursday, which backed up the timeline they'd already gotten from the answering machine. But none of the neighbors heard or saw anything strange on that Thursday night. And according to her neighbors, Jane did not have any obvious tension with anybody in the community. She generally kept to herself, but was really well liked by everyone who met her. But Salcedo, again, from what he had just seen at the crime scene, felt sure that someone out there had to have had a problem with Jane. He'd seen the autopsy that morning, and it confirmed that Jane, unsurprisingly, had died from the wounds to her head. But it also told him something else. She'd been hit more than a dozen times. It was complete overkill. And to Salcedo, it meant the killer had to have been driven by some kind of intense emotion, like rage or maybe greed, which was why they were now making this drive out to LA to speak with Marion, who Salcedo felt, based on her relationship to Jane, she was the strongest suspect they had, because romance can make you do crazy things. Also, Salcedo had done some digging into Jane's finances the night before, and he found out she had a life insurance policy worth $100,000. And Marion Reese was the sole beneficiary, which meant Marion definitely had something to gain financially, at least, from Jane's death. So as they pulled up to Marion's house, Salcedo was thinking, maybe we found our killer. A few minutes later, the detective sat on a couch in Marion Reese's living room. The home was on the small side, even by LA standards, but it was very tastefully decorated. Marion sat down across from them in an armchair, and when they looked at her, they could see her eyes were very red and puffy, like she'd been crying. She also had a glass of water in her hand that she kept lifting up like she was gonna take a sip, but then she would just place it back down again without taking a sip. It was like she didn't know what she was doing. Marion had clearly already heard about Jane's death, and to Salcedo, she really was showing every sign of genuinely being in shock. So he wanted to be very careful with his line of questions and make sure, he didn't overwhelm her. If she just shut down, he might not get the information that he really needed. So, after a minute, Salcedo began by just asking Marion how she knew Jane. And Marion, she took a deep breath, and then with a very shaky voice, she explained that they had known each other for almost 50 years. They used to work together. Jane had done a lot of producing for Marion's production company. As Marion went on to describe more about how they met each other and how it kind of transitioned from working together to, romance, Salcedo could sense that Marion was kind of calming down. And she was calming down to the point where he felt like now he could introduce the tough stuff. So he turned and he nodded to Sutton. And at that point, Sutton asked Marion if she knew that Jane had named her, Marion, as the sole beneficiary on her life insurance policy. And Marion immediately gasped, and she said she had no idea Jane had done that. But she also said it did sort of make sense. She said that Jane really didn't have any family, and in some ways, Marion was her family, or at least was her closest relationship. Now, Salcedo felt like Marion's reaction to this was very earnest, but he couldn't be sure. So he pressed her some more, and he asked her where she was last Thursday night when presumably, Jane was killed. But Marion just said she was with friends all night in LA, and she gave Salcedo all the phone numbers of these friends so he and his partner could confirm it. They talked for a while longer as Marion went over the details of how Jane missed their opera date on Friday and then stopped returning her calls, and it all lined up with what Jane's friend, Mary, had told them. So eventually, Salcedo and Sutton stood up to leave. Over an hour later, Detective Salcedo and Sutton were back in Laguna Niguel, California, and they parked their cruiser in front of Jane's condo. On their drive back from Marion's house in LA, the detectives had called some of Marion's friends to confirm her alibi. And they all confirmed that on the night Jane was killed, they were with her and she was in LA. And so now Salcedo had to admit that Marion was looking less and less like a suspect. So now the detectives were back at Jane's condo to look into another working theory about what might have happened here. Maybe Jane's murder was a hate crime. So remember, this was back in 2004 when being a homosexual was just not as widely accepted as it is today. And so their theory was, maybe one of Jane's neighbors had seen Marion, Jane's girlfriend, visiting, or maybe heard about their relationship and they didn't like it, and so they lashed out. And then also strengthening the idea that, one of the neighbors could have done this was the fact that it was sort of common knowledge in this neighborhood that most people left their doors unlocked. And so it sort of strengthened the idea that maybe a neighbor did this, maybe because of their hate towards Jane and her way of life. However, Sutton and Salcedo knew that actually investigating this theory was going to be extremely challenging. There were 144 houses in the complex, and so conducting a thorough investigation of every resident of all those houses was just going to take a lot of time. But they didn't have any other options, so the detectives got to work, and they went to the first house next to Jane's and knocked. A few hours later, Salcedo and Sutton returned to the Orange County Sheriff's Department, They had spent most of the afternoon talking to people who lived in Jane's condo complex, and while they hadn't talked to everyone, they already had to admit that their hate crime theory was looking sort of like a wash. Most people didn't even know Jane was in a relationship at all, since her girlfriend, Marion, lived in a different city, so they didn't see her. And also, there was just nothing anybody in the neighborhood said that made the detectives think that Jane was being targeted really for any reason. But a few people had mentioned that recently there had been some burglaries in the complex, which was completely unheard of in a place like Laguna Niguel. Still, there was a huge difference between somebody breaking in and stealing some stuff and breaking in and bludgeoning someone to death. But it was a lead. And that's what Salcedo was thinking about as he and Sutton walked towards their desks. But before they got there, Salcedo had this epiphany. And he just stopped in his tracks and he turned to Sutton and said, "Turn around. We have to go back to the evidence room. I think everything we need to solve this case might be in the building with them right now." The following day, Salcedo and Sutton pulled up in front of a restaurant called the Beach House. The previous afternoon, Salcedo had suggested that he and Sutton go back to the evidence room and listen to Jane's answering machine tapes. Now, to be clear, they had already listened to the tapes before, but none of the messages had seemed particularly important. But now, based on what they'd learned over the course of their investigation, they realized that those messages actually told them a lot. And so Salcedo and Sutton had spent hours re-listening to the tapes and gathering even more evidence to confirm what was on it. And even though they were pretty sure all this evidence they were getting told them who killed Jane, they still needed one more piece to fall into place. Now they had a book of photos with them, and they knew for a fact that one of these photographs was of their killer. And they just needed somebody in this restaurant to verify it. So as soon as they got inside, they found the manager and explained why they were there, and then they asked him, "Hey, would you mind looking at these photos to see if you recognize anyone?" The manager looked a bit alarmed, but he ultimately agreed and said he would. So they went into the back room, they opened up their book of photos, and the manager looked, and pretty much immediately he pointed to one picture. And when Salcedo saw the person the manager was pointing to, he knew they'd cracked the case. Based on forensic evidence and also a confession, here is what investigators believe happened to Jane Thompson in the early morning hours of June 25th, 2004. The killer, clad in dark clothes and gloves, and also holding a hammer, stood in the darkness right outside of Jane's back sliding glass doors. Now, the killer had already been to Jane's house a few times that night, but each time they had come earlier, they had ultimately chickened out and left, because when they would get there, they would look in the back door and they would see Jane asleep on the couch in front of the TV. But that was a problem. They needed Jane to leave the room and go to her bedroom to go sleep in there. But she wasn't doing that. But this time, as they stood outside the glass doors, they knew they had to go in there or they would never get what they wanted from Jane, even if she was right there on the couch. So the killer took a deep breath and then reached forward and tried to open the back door. And it slid right open, just as they expected. It was unlocked. Once it was open, the killer very carefully, very quietly, stepped inside and made their way over to the couch where Jane was. They wanted to check to make sure Jane was still asleep. But as the killer is hovering over Jane, looking down at her, she's on her back on the couch, the killer practically fainted when Jane opened her eyes and looked right at them. And the killer was so surprised and so scared that they instinctively lifted up their hammer and brought it down on Jane's head. And when the killer finally stopped and kind of calmed down for a second, they just stared at Jane's destroyed body in total shock. Then they backed away and realized the hammer, the murder weapon, was dripping blood everywhere. So they grabbed the head of the hammer with their gloved hand to kind of stop it from dripping and then ran right back out the sliding door. The killer hurried across the street outside, tossing the hammer into the trash as they went. And when they finally got to their home, they stripped off their clothes, balled them up, and then tried to decide where to hide them. And as they thought about that, they looked out their bedroom window at the house across the street, where they'd just killed the one person who had given them a second chance. It would turn out Jane was murdered by a child, her 15-year-old neighbor, Sam Nelson. Sam had actually broken into Jane's house more than once. He'd broken in repeatedly and stolen a lot of things from her, including her credit cards. That was what the phone messages had been about. Jane's credit card company had called her back after she had reported a series of fraudulent charges. And one of those charges was at that restaurant that the investigators visited with the photo lineup. And the manager, when he looked at the photos, recognized Sam, because Sam had been in there recently. The reason Sam was stealing from Jane and also from other people in the neighborhood was ultimately just because he was trying to keep up with his appearance. He used these stolen credit cards and money to buy food and items that would, in his mind, impress his wealthy classmates. On the night of Jane's murder, Sam did not go in there with the intention of killing her. He went in there with the intention of robbing her. But for whatever reason, when, she opened her eyes and saw him, he sort of panicked, hit her once with a hammer, the blood went in his mouth, his mind went blank, and then suddenly he's beating her to death. Sam was arrested and eventually sentenced to 25 years to life in prison for Jane's murder and also for multiple counts of burglary. His earliest eligible release date is in 2027. On the evening of June 3, 2004, a 23-year-old college junior named Jesse Valencia walked into a restaurant in Columbia, Missouri. His friends were already there. They were sitting at a table in the back of the restaurant, and as soon as they saw him, they waved him over. And so Jesse made his way over to sit with them. Jesse was a student at the University of Missouri, and he was majoring in journalism and pre-law. The spring semester had just ended a few weeks ago, and as much as Jesse had loved the semester and he really had enjoyed what he was studying, he was looking forward to some time off. He wanted to see his friends and go to some good parties. Jesse had always been a very outgoing person with a very active social life, but sometimes that characteristic sort of got him in trouble. In fact, just a couple of weeks ago, he'd had to go to court over a charge of obstructing a government operation, which he'd picked up 2 months earlier when he refused to leave a house party that the cops were breaking up. And as soon as he sat down at the table with his friends, one of them immediately asked him, hey, how'd that court hearing go? And Jesse had said, it didn't go too well. He thought the whole thing was kind of ridiculous, and he had hoped the charge would have been dropped already. But when he had gone to the courtroom, he found out the charge had actually been upgraded. The prosecutor had changed it to obstructing a government operation by physical interference, which was worse. But Jesse said, he still wasn't that worried about it. He said he had pleaded not guilty, and his plan was to fight this thing to the very end, even if it took all summer. However, the reality was this charge was actually the least of Jesse's problems. He had much bigger things weighing on his mind that summer. His longtime boyfriend, Jack Barry, had broken up with him recently, and he was having a very hard time coping with that. Jack had wanted to stay friends, but the reality was, even though, the intention was good, it just made things harder for Jesse, because it meant that Jesse and Jack were still spending quite a bit of time together and still talking and socializing. And while Jack felt like things were over romantically, Jesse didn't feel that way. It just sort of felt like they were perpetually on the verge of getting back together, even though they weren't. And then whenever Jesse would try to talk to Jack about, maybe trying to make things work again, Jack would immediately just turn him down. And so the whole situation was just really difficult. And so without Jack anymore, Jesse had become very lonely. And he had been trying to fill that void with random hookups, meeting guys online and inviting them to the hotel where he worked as a night clerk. But for the most part, it was sort of shallow and didn't mean anything. At one point, Jesse had been having this secret affair with an older man, which had been exciting. But deep down, what Jesse really wanted was just a real relationship like he had had with Jack. And these random hookups were not that. And so at this point, basically every time Jesse went out socially, no matter what he was doing, he was always kind of on the hunt for somebody who could potentially have, long-term relationship potential. And this night was no exception. And so that night, Jesse and his friends had a nice dinner together. And then when they were done, they left the restaurant and walked a few blocks to a gay dance club called SoCo Club. It was dark and the music was loud and thumping. And as soon as they walked inside, Jesse immediately weaved his way through the crowd on the dance floor over to the DJ booth. He asked the DJ to play his favorite song, which was Billie Jean by Michael Jackson. And the DJ just sort of rolled their eyes. Jesse knew the DJ was very likely annoyed with him because Jesse requested that song every single time he came to this club. But Jesse never had let other people's opinions stop him from doing what he wanted. And so he didn't care. He just wanted the song played. And so after he had made his request, Jesse went over to the bar and ordered a drink. And while he waited, he saw a young man standing alone at the other end of the bar. Once the bartender passed Jesse his drink, Jesse went over and asked the man if he wanted to dance. The man smiled and said, "Sure." And then one dance turned into two, turned into three, and pretty soon the two had spent the whole night together. Now, it was hard to hear each other over the loud music, but over the course of several dances, Jesse had learned that this man's name was Ed McDevitt, and he was training to be a chef. Jesse felt like Ed was a really nice, cool guy, and it seemed like they had an immediate connection. And so when the club closed, Jesse asked if Ed wanted to come home with him. Ed said yes, and after that, Jesse asked his friend Jennifer if she wouldn't mind giving them a ride back to Jesse's apartment. She said of course, and so shortly after that, the trio left the club, they got in Jennifer's car, and they drove back to Jesse's apartment. And when Jesse and Ed got out, Jennifer said, "Hey, tomorrow night I'm having a party at my place. You two should come by." And Jesse, he turned to Ed and kind of winked at him and said, "Yeah, hopefully we'll both be there." And then Jennifer drove off. After Jennifer had driven off, Jesse walked Ed down the stairs to his very run-down basement apartment. And as soon as they went inside, Ed saw this sea of all these history books stacked all over the living room. It would turn out Jesse was really into ancient Greek history. And so Ed began walking around, opening up all these old history books. And as Ed did, Jesse began regaling him with, tales of the Battle of Thermopylae, how the Spartans were outnumbered and how they prevailed, and talking about Zeus and the ancient Greek gods, and just kind of going off all the stuff that Jesse really enjoyed about, ancient Greek history. And Ed, as he listened to it, just said, I really don't know much about history, but it's really fascinating that you're so into it. And so from there, the rest of the night went great for the two of them. They would spend the night together. And then at 10 a.m. the next morning, as Ed was getting ready to leave, they made plans to meet up again at Jennifer's party that night. Before Ed left, he wrote his phone number down on a scrap piece of paper and gave it to Jesse. And Jesse took the paper and then walked Ed to the door and gave him a hug and a kiss before he left. And then once he was gone, Jesse just hoped that, maybe this wasn't just a meaningless hookup. Maybe this had the basis of a strong, long-term relationship. The one thing Jesse really wanted. Around noon that day, Jesse was eating a quick lunch before heading out for work when he heard a knock on his door. He walked over and opened it up, and he saw his landlord standing in the hallway. And his landlord looked pretty mad. He told Jesse that, hey, it's the 4th of the month, and you still haven't paid rent. Jesse apologized profusely and just said, it totally slipped his mind, and he promised he would get it to the landlord that afternoon. But after the landlord accepted his answer and, Jesse shut the door, he couldn't help but have this sort of sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach, because the truth was, he didn't have the money. Jesse had grown up in a very poor family in a small town in Kentucky. He was actually the first person in his whole family to go to college, and he had paid his bills by working as a hotel clerk, the same job his mother had had back home. Now, Jesse loved his family, and he spoke to them basically every single day. He would call them all the time. But at the same time, he had always felt so trapped in his conservative, ultra-religious hometown. So he had left and tried to sort of reinvent himself as someone new, the kind of person who can do anything and go anywhere. And so even though he had done that, it would turn out that making real money was something that he just hadn't quite figured out yet. Before Jesse left for work that afternoon, he scrounged up all the cash he could find, but it still wasn't enough to make rent. He dropped the cash in the landlord's mailbox anyway, with a note promising he would get the rest of it together in a couple of weeks. Then he walked to his job at the Campus Inn and spent an uneventful evening behind the front desk, counting down the hours until the end of his shift. And as soon as the end of his shift came, when the clock struck 11 p.m., he bolted home and immediately changed clothes before heading out to Jennifer's party, where he was supposed to meet his new love interest, Ed McDevitt. However, when Jesse walked into that party, he didn't see Ed. He did a lap around the apartment, checking every room, but he wasn't there. And so Jesse just grabbed a beer out of the fridge and began chatting with Jennifer while he waited. But after a while, he checked his watch and realized that either Ed was running really late or he just was not coming. So, trying to tell himself that it was not quite time to be disappointed, maybe there was an explanation here, Jesse went outside and called the phone number that Ed had written down on that piece of paper that morning. Now, this phone number was for a landline phone. And so, Jesse, he punched it in and he listened and it rang for a few beats. And then somebody picked up, and it was a guy, but it was not Ed. It was somebody whose name was Mark Butler, and Jesse had never heard of this guy, and he asked, where's Ed? And Mark explained that he was Ed's roommate, and that actually Ed was asleep right now. He had to work in the morning, and so he had decided actually not to go to the party, to Jennifer's party. He just wanted to sleep. Now, as Mark was telling him this, Jesse was trying to make sense of like, okay, is Mark like Ed's boyfriend or something? Are they together, or are they just roommates? And also, Jesse couldn't help but feel like Mark clearly did not want to be talking to Jesse right now. It was pretty clear in his tone that he was trying to just get off the phone. But Jesse was not ready to just, mail it in here. He wanted to see Ed. And so he told Mark, well, hold on a minute. Can you please go wake him up? I need to talk to him. And at first, Mark was like, no, he's asleep. He has work in the morning. Like, he does not want me waking him up. But Jesse was relentless and just begged Mark to please, just for a second, put him on the phone. And eventually, Mark relented. About a minute later, a very groggy-sounding Ed hopped on the phone, and as soon as Jesse heard his voice, he was so excited, and he basically pitched Ed hard on why he should not go to bed and come out to this party, and that he really wanted to see him. And also, hey, bring your friend Mark too. That was fine. Now, it's not really clear if Ed was excited about this idea, but he would eventually say, fine, I'll come out and meet you, and I will bring Mark. When they got there, Mark would only stay at Jennifer's party for a little while before he headed out on his own. But Ed and Jesse, they would stick around until about 2 a.m. And then at that point, they would leave Jennifer's house and go to another party across the street. At around 3 a.m. though, Ed said he really did have to get going. It was so late, he had to get up in the morning, like he had to go. And so at this point, Jesse understood that this was reasonable. And so he walked him out to the sidewalk and then asked him if, hey, do you want to come over to my place? But Ed said, no, really, I have to get home. I have to go to bed. However, before Ed did finally leave, the two of them would make plans to see each other in just a couple of days. After Ed had taken off, Jesse wandered across the street to say goodbye to Jennifer, and then after that, he began making the walk to his own apartment. And as he was making this short walk to his own place, he began to think that he didn't want to go home alone. If Ed didn't want to come over, well, he was going to find somebody else who would. And so his first thought was to call his ex, Jack. And so Jesse called Jack a few times, and when Jack did not pick up, after all, it's 3 a.m, and they are no longer in a relationship, it's sort of reasonable that he wouldn't, but at that point, Jesse still wanted to see him, and so he walked a few blocks out of his way to make an actual stop at Jack's apartment. Jesse went right up to the door and banged on it, but nobody came to the door. Jack didn't answer. At this point, Jesse began to wonder if, well, maybe Jack's out with somebody else right now, and he suddenly felt so jealous. Or worse, maybe Jack is here and he knows I'm here, but he doesn't want to see me and he's ignoring me. After a couple of minutes of standing there and knocking a few more times and still not hearing anything from Jack, Jesse finally gave up and stumbled back to his own apartment, drunk and lonely, and a bit heartbroken. Jesse finally stepped foot inside his apartment and shut the door behind him at about 3:45 a.m. However, right after he'd gotten undressed and flopped down on his bed, he heard a knock at the front door. At 2 p.m. the following day, so Saturday, June 5th, 2004, a college student walked out of an apartment just down the street from Jesse's building, and they were carrying a backpack and a cooler. His friends had just pulled into the parking lot, and they were about to head out for a weekend trip to St. Louis. But while he was loading his stuff into the trunk, he noticed somebody lying in the grass nearby, wearing nothing but a pair of running shorts. Now, at first, he assumed, this was just somebody passed out drunk from a crazy Friday night party, which sort of happened all the time in a college town like Columbia. But when he took a few steps closer to be sure this person was okay, he saw flies buzzing around their body. About 30 minutes later, Columbia police detective John Short felt his pager go off. He unclipped it from his belt loop, and he saw there was a message from his boss's phone number that just read 911. Detective Short called his boss right away, and he was given the address for a crime scene just off the University of Missouri campus. Short drove there, parked his car on the curb, and then walked over to the yellow tape that was keeping crowds of worried neighbors away from this crime scene. Another detective, Tim Geiger, waved to Short and led him over to the patch of grass where the victim was lying. It was a young man sprawled out on his back, and he was wearing a pair of light blue running shorts with no shoes, no socks, and no shirt. And across his throat was this very deep gash. The medical examiner was already there, and she was crouched down next to the body, and she told Detective Short that a few things were already standing out to her. She pointed to the bruises that were all over the victim's face, their arms, and their torso, But when she lifted the victim's hands, there were no defensive wounds on them. She told Short that that was pretty unusual for a knife attack, where the victims usually got their hands up, trying to defend themselves, and as a result, they got their hands cut up. She also pointed out that the blood had run down both sides of the victim's neck and pooled under his body. But there was no blood at all on the front of his body, which meant he was probably lying down right there in the grass when his throat actually got cut. Finally, the medical examiner pulled back the victim's eyelids and showed Short the hemorrhaging in his eyes, which they both knew was typically a sign of strangulation. And so putting it all together, Short theorized that, the victim's killer had likely choked him out and then laid him on the grass and then slit his throat while he was laying there unconscious, unable to defend himself. The detective looked down at his victim's bare feet and noticed they were covered in dirt, like he had been running at some point outside. Short doubted that the encounter between his victim and the killer began on the lawn where the body was found, and now he just wondered if maybe there had been some sort of a chase here, and that this was just where the killer had finally caught up to the victim. But since there was no ID on the victim, Short had no idea who he was or where he'd been running from. And so Short stood up and stepped away from the body so crime scene techs could load it into a body bag. Just then, another squad car pulled up, and 2 more officers got out. Sergeant Kenneth Smith and Officer Stephen Rios. Rios was the beat cop who typically patrolled this neighborhood, so another sergeant on scene had radioed for him to come over and see if maybe he could help identify the victim. And so at this point, Short told the crime scene techs to go ahead and unzip the body bag and let Officer Rios take a look. And Rios came over and he looked inside, and after a second, he said that he did recognize this young man. He said it was a college kid that he'd actually arrested at a house party just a couple of months ago. He said his name was Jesse Valencia. And so, less than an hour into his investigation, Detective Short now had a name for his victim and some pretty good guesses about how his victim was killed. His next task was figuring out who might have wanted Jesse Valencia dead. So, Short looked up Jesse's address, and he found his apartment building was only a block away. So, he walked over there. And while the forensics team went inside the apartment to look for evidence, an officer was posted outside the building to make sure no one came or went until the crime scene was officially cleared. Short walked into the building and headed down the stairs to Jesse's unit. And there, the crime scene tech who was dusting the doorway for prints told him that when they'd arrived, the door was actually already open. And so Short went inside the actual unit and began looking around. There was no blood anywhere, and nothing was broken or overturned, so there was no clear sign of a struggle. But the door being left open suggested that Jesse must have left in a hurry. And this certainly matched Short's theory about the fight between Jesse and his killer starting in one location and ending on the lawn. Short figured that, Jesse must have run out of his apartment in a panic and made it a block away to that grass before his killer finally overtook him. And so as Short began to consider this, he also started to think, okay, well, Jesse, who appeared to be in reasonably good shape for his age, if he was chased down and tackled and killed only a block away from his apartment, it sort of suggested that his killer likely was pretty strong and pretty fast. So we're talking about somebody who is in relatively good shape. That's the killer. At least that's the profile he's developed in his mind. And also, the way that Jesse was actually killed, having his throat cut open so violently, it just seemed kind of personal, which suggested that whoever killed Jesse likely was somebody Jesse actually knew. And so with that in mind, Short finished his sweep of Jesse's apartment and then asked a crime scene tech to prioritize getting access to the cell phone and computer that he saw on Jesse's desk. Then he walked out of the apartment and across the hall to the door of Jesse's closest neighbor, and he knocked. A moment later, a very confused-looking young man poked his head out and asked Short what was going on. Short told him that he was investigating a murder and wanted to ask him a few questions. The young man at first just seemed totally shocked and appalled to be hearing this, but then it was like this look of realization washed over his face. He told Short that the previous night, he had actually woken up to the sound of very clearly 2 grown men fighting in Jesse's apartment. And one of those men was clearly Jesse, because this neighbor heard Jesse clearly saying over and over again, "No, and stop it," to this other man. Now, the neighbor kind of sheepishly said, they didn't actually do anything about this. They actually just kind of banged on their own wall and said, "Hey, stop it over there." And then shortly after that, the noise had stopped and the neighbor had kind of forgotten about it and
gone to sleep, not realizing what he was likely hearing was the beginning of Jesse's murder. The neighbor told Short that when they had woken up that afternoon, he'd actually gone across the hall to apologize to Jesse for being so rude the night before. But the neighbor said he found Jesse's door was open, and he didn't look inside. He felt like that was kind of rude. But what he thought was, okay, maybe Jesse was so drunk the night before, that was part of the reason that he must have been having this fight. And so perhaps he was so drunk, he just forgot to close the door. The neighbor said he did try knocking on the opened door a couple of times, but Jesse never came to the door, and so the neighbor just kind of left it at that and went about their business. And so after hearing this, Detective Short asked this neighbor if he had any idea who the other man was that Jesse was fighting with. But the neighbor said he didn't. Jesse, for the most part, kept to himself, and really the neighbor didn't know Jesse well at all, so he did not know who this other person was. After that, Short thanked the neighbor for the information, then he turned around and headed back inside of Jesse's apartment. And so at this point, Short was convinced that, based on the neighbor's testimony, that whatever fight led to Jesse's death likely did begin in Jesse's apartment. And so now Short just had to figure out who were the people that could have potentially been inside of Jesse's apartment late at night like that. Was this somebody who was a friend, a love interest? Was Jesse trying to kick them out and it spurned a fight? He didn't know, but who were the people in Jesse's life that could have been there late at night? That's what he had to figure out. And luckily, at that very moment, one of the crime scene techs had Jesse's cell phone and he was holding it in the air like he had found something. Now, they wouldn't be able to do a full phone dump until they got it back to the station, and they hadn't even touched the laptop yet. But they had gotten access to Jesse's call logs, and the tech told Short that there was something in there that he definitely wanted to see. Because the last time Jesse used his cell phone, according to this log, it was to call somebody named Jack Berry 7 times between 3 and 3:18 that morning. So right away, Detective Short looked up Jack Berry's information, and he found his apartment's address and saw it was not far from Jesse's, and so he drove right over there. Short knocked on the door, and just a moment later, a young man answered, and he had very red, puffy eyes like he'd clearly been crying. Even though Jesse's body had only been discovered a few hours ago, this young man did not seem surprised at all to see the detective. He told the detective that he had already heard the terrible news a friend had told him. After exchanging niceties and the young man confirming that he was in fact Jack, Short followed Jack into his living room. And as they sat down, Short asked Jack about all those 3 a.m. phone calls from Jesse. Jack looked like he was really struggling to hold it together as he told the detective that Jesse was his ex-boyfriend and Jesse had kept badgering him, Jack, for them to get back together, and Jack didn't want to. And so those phone calls were very likely a product of more badgering from Jack. Jack said the night before, he had been woken up by his phone ringing over and over and over again, and before he could even look at the caller ID, he heard a knock at his front door. And he saw it was the middle of the night, and then he leaned over and saw the caller was Jesse, and he sort of figured that, okay, he's calling me, it's very likely him at the front door, I don't want to see him right now, and so Jack just decided he would ignore Jesse and hope he went away. Now, when Jack said this, it seemed very clear he was sort of reliving that moment in his mind, like, maybe if he had let Jesse in or engaged with him in some way, maybe Jesse would still be alive. That was sort of the insinuation. But Detective Short was thinking, okay, well, even though he seems like he's being very earnest in telling me this, it does mean that he doesn't really have an alibi. He's basically saying, at the time, Jesse was killed, I was home alone by myself, which was pretty weak. However, before Short could begin to poke holes in the alibi, Jack said that, despite the fact that they had broken up, that he and Jesse were, at least in his mind, still on good terms. In fact, they had spoken just the day before on the phone, before getting all those nighttime phone calls. It was during the afternoon, and during that phone call, Jesse had told him about a new guy he'd met at a club the night before, and his name was Ed McDevitt. That night, Detective Short stood outside of an interrogation room at the police station, watching Ed McDevitt through the two-way glass. Short knew his investigation was moving basically at lightning speed here, but there was still quite a bit of pressure on him to get this case solved even faster, because Columbia was a college town where kids were used to feeling safe, And the murder of a student just a few blocks off campus had sort of shattered that sense of trust. And so, students and parents and, staff of the university really wanted Short to get this thing done. And now, looking at Ed through the glass, Short wondered if maybe this was the killer. Maybe this was the guy. After all, Ed was shaking and fidgety looking. He seemed sort of like an emotional wreck, which could mean, of course, he was just upset because he was connected to the murder victim. That's traumatic. Or it could mean he's hiding something, and now he's about to be interrogated by the police, something that would certainly cause a big emotional reaction. Eventually, Short went inside and sat down across the table, and he asked Ed to explain exactly what he had done the night before. And Ed, in a very nervous, shaky voice, told the detective that he and his roommate, a guy named Mark Butler, had met Jesse at a party a little after 11 p.m. He said he ultimately went back home again around 3 a.m., leaving Jesse on the sidewalk, still very alive and well. Ed said his roommate Mark had actually seen him return to his apartment at 3 a.m., and Ed said when he went inside, he went straight to bed, and then he had gotten up early for work. Ed said he was at work when he got the call from police, telling him that Jesse had been found dead. Detective Short listened to Ed's story and asked a few follow-up questions, and then also took a DNA sample from Ed. And then after that, he told Ed that he was also going to get a warrant to search Ed's home. Ed was already such a wreck that, when Short told him about this, search of his home, Ed didn't even really react. However, when Short left the interview room, despite feeling pretty confident that Ed could absolutely be a suspect, he also went and, followed procedure and looked up Ed's roommate, Mark Butler. And he discovered in the police department system that there was Mark Butler, and sure enough, he had a criminal record. So, overnight, while a forensics team was searching Ed and Mark's home, Short actually brought Mark down to the station for an interview. But in reality, Short wasn't expecting Mark to become this primary suspect here. He just wanted to be thorough and rule out anybody who'd seen Jesse that night, and obviously Mark was one of those people. But almost immediately in their interview, Mark started saying some very odd things. He told Short right out the gate that he did not like Jesse, and actually he said point blank that he didn't really care that Jesse was dead. But he also clarified to Detective Short that, he was just Ed's roommate. He was not seeing him romantically, so this had nothing to do with jealousy. He just did not like Jesse. Mark confirmed that he did see Ed when he returned from the party around 3 a.m., just like Ed had said, but Mark had actually not stuck around. He said that after Ed had come back to the apartment, Mark had left to go on a date of his own, and he actually didn't know what time he got back. And so as he was saying this, Short realized that meant Mark was out and about, sort of unaccounted for, at the same time that Jesse was killed. And so obviously, something seemed off about Mark. And so Short took a DNA sample and added Mark to the suspect list. The next morning, Sunday, June 6th, after catching a few hours of sleep, Detective Short gathered his team for a meeting. The mood was tense. Everybody was exhausted and very much on edge from spending nearly 24 hours straight working on this case. But when they went around the room and talked about the flood of leads they'd all followed up on yesterday, it didn't actually seem like they had much to show for it. There were now several suspects in play, but none of them seemed to have a good reason to want to kill Jesse Valencia. Jesse apparently had been hounding his ex-boyfriend Jack about trying to get back together, which Jack did not want, and the multiple late-night phone calls and the knocking on the door unannounced, it just seemed like harassment. So it was possible that maybe Jack had gone over to confront Jesse and things got out of hand. But Jack had told Detective Short that he and Jesse had remained friends after the breakup, and some of the other detectives said that Jesse's friends had said the same thing. The two had remained friends. So it seemed pretty unlikely that things between them would have escalated so much that, somebody got killed. Then there was Ed McDevitt, Jesse's new lover, who had seemed pretty nervous during his interrogation. One of the detectives told Short that while searching Ed's house, they'd found a bag full of chef's knives, and some of them were large and sharp enough that they could easily have been the murder weapon. But Ed worked in a restaurant and was training to be a chef, so owning kitchen knives was hardly a smoking gun. And then as for Ed's roommate, Mark Butler, he did have a criminal past and openly said he did not like Jesse and didn't care that he died. But they'd only met one time, and very likely they would never have seen each other again. So it seemed very unlikely that he would go through the trouble of following Jesse home and killing him. Like, to what end? And so Detective Short was getting really frustrated. He just couldn't make sense of any of these suspects. It was like something was missing here. And so he turned to two of his detectives, Jeff Westbrook and Barbara Cook, and told them to go to some local bars that Jesse frequented and just sort of ask around about Jesse, in case there were other leads that they had not uncovered yet. However, right after Detective Short walked out of that meeting that morning, another detective ran up to him and pulled him into a quiet corner and told him a tip had just come in. And it was so sensitive that they were going to have to keep it under wraps even amongst the investigators. The detective told Short that a friend of Jesse's who lived in St. Louis had called the tip in through Crime Stoppers. He said that he and Jesse chatted online all the time, and that Jesse at one point had told him about a secret affair he was having with an older man. And this older man was actually an officer in the Columbia Police Department. Later that day, so this is Sunday, June 6th, 2004, 2 days after Jesse was killed, Detective Short sat at his desk flipping through printouts of all these online chat logs. And these logs showed conversations between Jesse and the friend of his who had called in the tip that Jesse was having this affair with an officer from Short's own police department. In the chats, Jesse wrote all about this relationship. Jesse had seemed to find it pretty exciting at first, having this police officer come by in uniform and carrying on these secret meetups in the middle of the night. But recently, Jesse had begun to suspect that this police officer was married, and this made Jesse furious. He had told this friend in the chat log that he wasn't going to be someone's other woman. However, to Short's frustration, Jesse never actually named the officer that he was having this affair with. He only ever referred to him as Columbia's finest. And so whoever this mystery cop was, Detective Short thought they were the most likely suspect. Because unlike Jesse's other lovers, this officer had something to lose if this relationship went south. If Jesse told anybody about this affair, well, the police officer's career could be on the line because they clearly were carrying on this totally illicit affair while on duty. That's not okay. And also they were using their position and power potentially to actually land this relationship. And then also on top of that, the police officer's marriage would likely be destroyed. But Short also knew that he had to move very carefully here, because now he was investigating his own department, which meant that the killer could literally be in the room with him at any time. And so as he walked through the office to refill his coffee, Short found himself scanning the face of every officer he passed, and he realized there wasn't a single person here he could actually trust. Short brought all the files on Jesse's case into his office, and then he told his secretary to find him a roster of the department's entire staff. Then he locked the door, sat at his desk, and pulled out the records on Jesse's friends who had been interviewed already. And he went down the list himself, calling each and every one of them to dig for more information. Quite a few of them said that Jesse had told them about this cop he was sleeping with, and one of them remembered Jesse referring to this officer as just Anderson. And so when Short's secretary came back with the staff roster, Short began looking through it, and he discovered out of the 200 plus officers in the entire department, there were only 2 officers that had the name Anderson: Brad Anderson and Ted Anderson. And so the next step was trying to figure out if either of them had a connection to Jesse Valencia. And so Short pulled out the records from Jesse's arrest at the house party back in April. And as he flipped through it, he realized Brad Anderson was one of the 3 officers who responded to that party. The pieces fit together perfectly. Jesse and Brad Anderson, the police officer, would have met around the same time that Jesse began messaging his friend in St. Louis about this secret affair with a cop. And so at this point, Short felt like he had just found the killer. So he grabbed a manila folder off his desk, stepped out of his office, locking the door behind him. Then he did a lap around the whole station, and eventually he spotted Brad Anderson in the locker room, chatting with a few other officers as he put on his uniform. Now, Short wanted to be very careful here, because if Brad Anderson was the killer, he certainly didn't want him to realize he was under suspicion right now. So Short waited in the hallway until Brad walked out of the locker room, And then, as casually as possible, Short caught up with him and pulled him aside. Short opened up the manila folder he had brought with him and showed Brad a photo of Jesse Valencia, asking if he recognized him. And Brad squinted at the photo for a second, and then after thinking, he said, "Yeah, that's the kid I arrested at a party a few months ago." Short asked Brad if he had seen Jesse at all since the arrest. And Brad nodded and said, yeah. He said that about a month ago, Jesse had called in a noise complaint, and Brad had been the one sent out to check on it. But by the time Brad got there, the noise had stopped, so he was only there for a couple of minutes before leaving. And that was it. To Short, nothing about Brad's demeanor seemed nervous or suspicious. In fact, it really seemed like he didn't have any clue why the detective was asking him about Jesse Valencia. So if he was the killer, it seemed like he was going to be very hard to crack. Short was about to let Brad go and just wait to talk to him once he had more evidence, but just then, Brad's partner, Officer Rios, walked by. And when he walked by, he looked over and he saw the manila folder with Jesse Valencia's photo inside of it that Short was showing Brad Anderson. And Rios, without even thinking, made this comment under his breath that was clearly directed at his partner. It was like this really in bad taste comment where he was like, "Oh, looks like your gay lover's dead." When Short heard this, he practically sprinted back to his office. Brad Anderson sort of shrugged off the comment made by Rios about, Jesse being his gay lover, but Short felt like what Rios said was a pretty big deal, because even though, again, it was terrible in bad taste humor, that's a terrible thing to say, but maybe there's truth there. Maybe Rios knows that Brad Anderson was seeing Jesse Valencia. Maybe they really were in a relationship. Now, in the moment, Short did not, aggressively follow up on that comment and demand to know if Brad had actually been in a relationship with Jesse before he died. Instead, all three of them just kind of went their separate ways, and Short, hustled back to his office. And when he was in his office, right as he sat down, there was a knock on the door. And when the door opened, it was Short's secretary. And she told him there was someone who had been waiting to see him. And then she let in this very nervous-looking young man who introduced himself as Jesse's friend. And he said his name was Andy Schermerhorn. Andy sat down and told Short that just a few weeks earlier, he and Jesse had gone out together and then gone back to Jesse's apartment. But around 3 a.m., they were interrupted by a knock on the door. Jesse went to answer it, and a uniformed police officer walked in, shining a flashlight. And to Andy's surprise, Jesse led this officer right into the bedroom, and he joined them for a threesome. And then after they were done, the cop told Andy, "You better keep this a secret." Detective Short couldn't believe it. The final piece of evidence he needed had just fallen into his lap. Andy said he did not know the officer's name. So Detective Short got out a department yearbook and told him to flip through it to see if maybe the guy he saw that night was in there. But Andy just held up his hand and said he didn't need to do that. And Detective Short was like, "Well, what do you mean? Why can't you do that?" And Andy said, "Well, because when I came in here, the guy I met, he was out in the hall." Based on the investigation that would follow this revelation, the following is what happened to Jesse Valencia in the early morning of June 5th, 2004. Around 3 a.m., right around the time that Jesse was leaving his friend Jennifer's party, Jesse's killer was drinking beers with a few friends after work. And then, just before dawn, the killer wrapped up, got in their car to drive home. But as they were driving, they decided to make a stop along the way, at Jesse's apartment. They were expecting another quick, no-strings-attached, late-night, secret hookup. But when they got there, Jesse was very drunk and in a terrible mood. Jesse told the killer that he had figured out they were married, and so now he was not interested in them at all. He didn't want to see him anymore. But when he told the killer to leave and the killer refused, Jesse said, "Fine, I'll go to your police chief and I will tell them about our affair." And that's when the killer snapped. If their secret got out, it would cost them everything. So in their mind, they had to silence Jesse before he could ruin them. Jesse tried to run, but he only made it about a block before the killer caught up with him, wrapped an arm around his neck and put him in a vicious chokehold until his body went limp. And then the killer laid Jesse out on the grass, took out a pocket knife, and brutally slashed his throat. And then, on the way home, the killer very skillfully disposed of the murder weapon, ensuring nobody would ever find it, because they knew the knife was the only piece of hard evidence that could ever link them to the murder. After that, they made their way back home, parked in the driveway, and as they were walking up to the front door, they looked up and saw their wife in the kitchen window, preparing a bottle for their baby son. And then just before going inside, the killer unpinned the name tag on their uniform that said Anderson, and they swapped it for another name tag that they had hidden in their glove box. And this name tag was the killer's real name, Officer Stephen Rios. Rios was Brad Anderson's partner. He was the one who identified Jesse's body at the crime scene and made that awful comment about Brad Anderson's gay lover. It's believed that Officer Rios was lying to Jesse about his name, and in fact, he actually stole the name tag not of Brad Anderson, but of the other Anderson, Ted Anderson. He was using his name tag and parading around like he was him whenever he was with Jesse. Rios was arrested, and in May of 2005, almost a year after Jesse's murder, he was found guilty of first-degree murder. But after an appeal, he got a new trial, and the charge was reduced to second-degree murder. However, he was still found guilty and was sentenced to life in prison. At about 8:20 in the morning on June 29, 2025, an 83-year-old woman named June Baxter shuffled her way down the hallway of her small home in Attleboro, which is a quiet town in eastern England. As she walked, she had to keep one hand on the wall to keep her balance. She was pretty frail these days and also just had a lot of medical problems. But she also really valued her independence, and so she was determined to keep living alone, even if it was kind of risky. So June used to live with her husband and their dog. But about 7 years earlier, her husband had gotten really sick, and so because of that, they'd had to give their dog to their granddaughter because they just couldn't take care of it anymore and also care for him. And then unfortunately, June's husband did pass away, and so she was left all alone. But even though she was, all alone in terms of living in the house by herself, she wasn't completely isolated. Her granddaughter, who she had given the dog to, lived close by and visited a whole bunch, and almost always brought along June's old dog, which June loved. Now, in addition to just being good company, June's granddaughter also regularly made herself available to help June with all sorts of basic things, like, picking up her prescriptions and going grocery shopping for her and, driving her to and from doctor's appointments. Like, she was really available to her. But despite June knowing that, knowing she could always call on her, she tried hard not to call on her granddaughter, because again, she just really liked being independent. So on this particular day, she, continued slowly walking down the hallway, guiding herself by holding onto the wall, and then she turned the corner to go to the bathroom. And when she stepped inside, she slipped on the tile. And as she was falling to the ground, her leg scraped the corner of the bathroom counter. Immediately, June's leg started bleeding and June's yelling out in pain, but she lives alone, nobody can hear her. And so June quickly went from, just reacting to the pain and the blood. June was scared. I mean, this is the exact scenario that she was so worried about, getting hurt when she was all alone, because she didn't really have a plan. It was like, I'm gonna live alone, so help me. But fortunately for June, she had installed throughout her house all these emergency call bells that would allow her to basically, hit the bell, and they were programmed to contact both her granddaughter and also the local emergency services. And in the bathroom, there was one of these bells. And so once she kind of composed herself a little bit, grabbed the string for this bell, and she pulled it. About 10 minutes later, June was still in the bathroom on the ground, holding onto her leg wound, when she heard the front door of her house swing open. And immediately she heard the sound of her granddaughter calling out for her. And June, as best as she could, even though her voice was a little bit weak, she called out and said where she was. A moment later, June's granddaughter, along with June's old dog she'd brought along, came bombing around the corner, and they looked into the bathroom and they saw, June and her horrible leg wound, and clearly the granddaughter is really worried right away. I mean, this was a very bad cut. But, for June, she's looking at her granddaughter and she's just flooded with relief because she knows no matter how bad this is, her granddaughter is here, everything's fine, and also her dog was here, which made everything better already. And so while June's granddaughter began rummaging through the bathroom to look for some bandages, June just kind of relaxed and just began petting her dog, who was clearly very worried about June. This is her dog previously. They had a very strong bond. And so she's just petting her dog, and then, June's granddaughter did find some bandages and she wrapped up June's leg. And then by the time the paramedics got there, June actually was feeling basically okay. I mean, her leg definitely hurt, but she was very calm at this point. A couple of minutes later, the paramedics arrived, and by this point, June was actually feeling basically back to normal. I mean, her leg definitely still hurt, but again, her granddaughter had put that dressing on it and basically stopped the bleeding, and also June has her dog that she's petting, like her comfort animal. And so she was very calm. The paramedics come in and they assess her and they take off the dressing to check the wound, and after they cleaned it, they said, look, this is a pretty minor cut. You don't even need stitches. I think you're okay. Just be careful and maybe have your granddaughter stay here for a little bit just to make sure you don't fall again, but you're okay. Like, we're gonna go. And so June, she thanked the paramedics as they walked out the door, and then she and her granddaughter and the dog just sort of sat there feeling grateful that this fall wasn't more serious. However, the next morning when June woke up, she knew something was wrong because, all she's doing is laying in bed, but her heart is racing, she's sweating, she's lightheaded, like clearly something is off here. Now, the day before, after the paramedics left, her granddaughter did stick around for a little bit, but really, June was okay, and so June was alone. And that night, she had some soreness around the cut, but it really wasn't that serious. She really felt like dodged a bullet there. But now, 12 hours later, something's going on here. Now, June had no way of knowing if her current symptoms were indeed connected to her, minor cut on her leg. But her concern that maybe this was serious and could potentially spiral really quickly made her not pull on one of those emergency bells, but instead she just picked up the phone and called an ambulance to take her to the hospital. When she got to the hospital, doctors immediately began running all these tests on her. And very quickly, they determined that she did have a very severe bacterial infection, which she must have gotten after cutting her leg. And unfortunately, that infection had already spread into her blood, which would explain why she was feeling sweaty and lightheaded and why her heart was racing. Now, the medical staff definitely had some questions, like how in the world could this have developed so quickly, especially after the paramedics the day before had, at least according to them, properly cleaned this wound before they left. But, their issue now was not how did this happen, but instead just stabilize June, treat her. And so right away, they began treating June with general antibiotics to try to fight off this infection. But it just wasn't working. And June was 83 and already in relatively poor health, and her condition was clearly deteriorating rapidly. So the doctors began running more tests to try to determine exactly what type of bacteria was causing this infection. Because if they knew that, they might be able to give her more targeted treatment than just general antibiotics, which clearly were not working. And they did eventually identify this bacteria. But by the time they did, June had unfortunately already developed sepsis, which is a life-threatening condition that occurs when a person's body tries so hard to fight off an infection that it basically ends up damaging their vital organs in the process. Medical staff did everything they could, but it wasn't enough. And so eventually, 1 week after going to the hospital, June passed away. It would turn out the deadly bacteria that found its way into June's open wound was introduced to her by her granddaughter, completely by accident. The bacteria is called Pasteurella multicida, and it's found in a very specific place, inside the mouths of domestic dogs. While June laid on the bathroom floor waiting for her granddaughter to find bandages to wrap up her leg, June's old beloved dog, who her granddaughter had brought over, was trying to comfort June, and June was allowing the dog to do that. But what the dog was actually doing to comfort June, was licking her open wound. And so that led to the bacteria going in, and it would kill June 1 week later. On the afternoon of March 4th, 2000, a 40-year-old woman named Ines Ramirez stood in the kitchen of her tiny one-room home, which was deep in the mountains of Oaxaca, Mexico. Ines had a whole chicken on the counter right in front of her that she had just killed and plucked, and now she was using a 6-inch long knife to butcher it for their dinner. And as she did this, every once in a while, she would look out the window to check on her 7 kids who were playing together out in the yard. So Ines and her large family lived in a very isolated rural community of about maybe 500 people. They didn't have running water or electricity or a phone, and they lived miles away from their closest neighbors. They mainly lived off of corn and vegetables that they grew themselves, chickens they raised, and then wild animals that Enos's husband would catch. Her husband was actually gone that day because he was out in the mountains hunting for deer. And so as Enos is just kind of going about her fairly typical evening routine here, making dinner, she suddenly felt this really intense, very painful cramping sensation that was kind of ripping through her abdomen. And it hurt so bad that Enos stopped what she was doing and kind of doubled over and grabbed the counter and just tried to steady her breathing. I mean, this was really shocking. And for about a minute, Enos just stood there, holding onto the counter, just waiting for this pain to pass, and eventually it did. And once it eased up, it was like, okay, she was back to normal and she could stand up again. But this was sort of alarming. But at the same time, Enos was used to dealing with basically all medical crises on her own. They lived in this isolated part of the world, and the nearest medical clinic was 50 miles away, and they didn't have a car. So, like anything that happened, they basically had to deal with it themselves, and that was routine. And so for Enos, despite how incredibly painful this was, she just told herself, now that it had passed, the pain was gone, she said, you know what? It's probably fine. I'm good. And so pretty quickly, she just kind of forgot about it and went back to butchering the chicken. But several hours later, this is after midnight now, the pain came right back. And at this point, Enos, she's in this one common room in her house where all her kids are fast asleep. It's past midnight now, and she's sitting on this bench and she's gripping her abdomen, rocking back and forth as this pain just rockets back and forth across her abdomen constantly. There's no relief, nothing. And she's trying so hard not to make a sound because she doesn't want to wake her kids up, nor does she want to scare her kids. Her husband is still off in the mountains hunting for deer, so she is alone. She just has this little flickering candle nearby. That's the only light she's got, and she's just isolated, dealing with this excruciating pain. And so at this point, Enos really felt like this could be a real problem. This might not be something she could just brush off and let pass on its own. This was real. This was an actual emergency. But what can she even do? There's nowhere to go. She can't do anything. She is just completely trapped here with this excruciating pain that's making it hard to even have coherent thought. It's so bad. But the one thought that kept going through her mind was she had to do something, or whatever this was. It felt like it was going to kill her. And so Enos felt like she really only had one option here, and it was a horrible, horrible option. But she knew she had to do it. And so she got up and she's hunched over in pain, and as quietly as she could, she walked over to a cabinet and she opened it up and she grabbed a small bottle of alcohol. And she took a few sips to kind of numb the pain a little bit. And then after she had done that, she turned around and, still with this blinding pain, she hobbled into the kitchen and she grabbed that 6-inch knife she had used earlier to butcher the chicken. And then she walked right back over to the bench near that candle that she'd been sitting on earlier. And once she was there, she reached down and she pulled up her shirt, exposing her abdomen, where this pain was coming from. And then she took the knife and she plunged it into her abdomen. And immediately she let out this blood-curdling scream. She couldn't help it. And she was sort of vaguely aware of all her kids waking up and sort of making their way over to her, but she was so focused on what she was doing, and she began slowly dragging this blade down her abdomen all the way to her belly button. And then she pulled out the knife and she can barely think. It's so painful. Her kids are crying. And then she plunged the knife back into her abdomen and raked it down the other side, creating this massive gash in her stomach. And then she kind of dropped the knife and she's screaming. She can't even help it, and her kids are all crying. And she takes her hand and she reaches into her stomach and she's fishing around. Every little move is like lightning striking her body. But she eventually finds what she's looking for and she pulls it out of her stomach. And what she's looking at is her 8th child, a baby boy. And she had enough wherewithal to take that knife and cut the umbilical cord and place the baby down before she passed out. After Enos lost consciousness, one of her kids left the house and just started running to go find the nearest person to get some help. And miraculously, after finding some people, when those first responders got to the home where Enos was, hours later, they found her and her newborn son alive. and they were taken to the closest hospital for emergency treatment, and they would both make full recoveries. Today, Ines Ramirez is the only woman ever who has performed a successful C-section on herself. In the early morning hours of December 3rd, 1921, a 62-year-old woman named Augusta Mrballen lay awake in her bedroom inside of her daughter's house in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Augusta had lived with her daughter now for about a year. She had moved in after her husband had passed away. She just really hated being alone, and at night in particular, it was difficult to sleep sometimes. Just the weight of the loneliness was very intense. And also, Augusta was known to have really visceral bad dreams, and so that, combined with loneliness, made living alone really awful. So here she was, living with her daughter. But on this particular night, Augusta, she was wide awake in bed because she had had one of these awful nightmares, but she knew she could not tell her daughter about it. Now, normally one of the ways that Augusta would cope with these terrible nightmares, even when she was living alone, is she would get in touch with her daughter and they would talk about it. They would try to figure out if there was meaning in this awfulness of these nightmares. And sometimes they felt like they did find deeper meaning, and it sort of was cathartic for Augusta. But on this night, the dream she had just had, this nightmare, this visceral, awful nightmare, she knew, based on what she believed it meant, she absolutely could not tell her daughter anything about it. She had to hide it at all costs. In the dream Augusta had just had, she kind of came to, and she was in her daughter's basement, so in the basement of the house she was in right now. And in front of her on the ground were these two perfectly circular, very, very deep holes, just that went straight into the ground. And so Augusta, she found herself walking towards the edge and looking over, and she saw it was like this unbelievable abyss in each hole. It's like it went on into infinity. But despite this innate fear she had for these holes, she sat down on the edge of one of these holes and basically dangled her feet over this, cataclysmic abyss below her. And as she's sitting there like a child dangling her feet, these two men in dark clothes, they wander over out of the shadows and they walk behind Augusta. They don't interact with her, and they go to the other hole, the hole that is next to Augusta. And she looks at these men, and they're not looking at her. They're doing something. They're clearly in the middle of some sort of act. And they pull this huge carpet seemingly out of nowhere, and the two men stretch it out over this other hole next to Augusta, and they lay it over the hole. And as soon as Augusta saw that, she suddenly understood what was happening here, and she was horrified. So she woke up. And now here she was, knowing that based on what she just saw in her mind's eye in this horrible nightmare, that she could never share it with anyone, that she would live with the secret. So Augusta would eventually fall back to sleep that night, and she would get up in the morning, and she would not tell her daughter, Henrietta, anything about this dream she had had. She played it off like everything was just fine. But over the course of the day, Henrietta, even though she didn't say anything, began to notice that her mom was just acting really weird, like something was on her mind. And finally, at night, when the two of them sat down for dinner, this is basically, 24 hours, give or take, from when Augusta had this dream, right? They're sitting down for dinner, and Augusta, she's not eating, she seems totally disconnected, and she just seems off. And Henrietta's like, "Mom, what is going on with you?" And Augusta, at this point, realized she must be giving off very negative vibes here. And so she told her daughter, "Don't worry, I'm fine, I'm sorry, I'm not hungry. Everything's fine, I'm just feeling a little bit off. So everything's fine." But Henrietta realistically did not believe her mom, but she didn't push her. She said, okay. And they finished their dinner, and then before long, Augusta had gone to bed. But the next morning, when Henrietta got up, she went downstairs expecting to see her mom, but Augusta was nowhere to be found. And so again, feeling kind of concerned about her mom's behavior, she went to Augusta's bedroom to check on her, and she found her mom seeming really weak and lethargic and just totally out of it, laying in bed. And she asked her mom, really, what's going on with you? Are you not feeling well? What's happening here? And her mom just said, I just don't want to get out of bed. I'm feeling under the weather. I'm going to stay here. But even though Henrietta could see her mom was clearly downplaying this, she just felt like there's too many red flags. So she called a doctor. And a doctor came to the house, and a doctor examined Augusta, And they determined that, it wasn't really clear exactly what was going on with her. Clearly she's not feeling great, but the only thing they found was that her heart sounded a little bit weak. And so the doctor suggested that Augusta just, rest, have some water, eat some food, and just stay in bed, and you should get better. But despite Augusta doing what the doctor said and basically remaining on bed rest, she didn't get better. And in fact, Henrietta, her daughter, is watching, and she's clearly seeing that not only is her mother deteriorating physically, but she was also becoming more and more despondent and sort of disconnected emotionally. It was like she was drifting off into some other world that Henrietta was not a part of, and she was just so worried about her mom. And so finally, on December 7th, so this is for reference, 5 days after Augusta had that visceral nightmare that she felt like she couldn't share with anybody, Henrietta went into her mother's room and she sat on the edge of the bed and she said to her mom, "You gotta tell me what's going on. It seems like there's something else here that you're not sharing with me. You gotta tell me. I don't care what it is, but I gotta know." Augusta, when she heard her daughter saying this, she sort of thought about trying to keep doing the same thing she was doing, which was, basically say everything's fine and push her daughter off. But she could tell Henrietta was not gonna take that for an answer. And so Augusta sighed and she said, "I had that dream again. Except this time, I watched the procedure." Now, to us, this is, cryptic and weird and doesn't really mean anything. But to Henrietta, who understood what her mom was talking about, she was completely horrified. It would turn out Augusta really did have horrible nightmares that plagued her for at least the last year or so. But it was like a recurring nightmare. She didn't have different variations. It basically was the exact same nightmare that just really upset her. The way it went is, she would open her eyes in this nightmare, and in front of her would be these two bottomless pits, these huge holes in the ground. Now, she wouldn't know what these holes are, but she'd be able to tell that she was in an environment that she recognized. One time she saw that she was in her sister-in-law's garden. Another time she saw she was in her neighbor's backyard. She knew where she was, but she didn't understand these holes. But in this nightmare, she would always walk up to the holes, and then she, not two men who walked in, but she would take a rug out and cover up one of those holes, and then she'd wake up. Now, on its face, this does not sound like a particularly frightening dream. But there's a connection to the real world that made it frightening. Every time Augusta would have these nightmares, the person who lived at the property where the dream took place, the sister-in-law's garden, the neighbor's backyard, when she would have that dream, she would come to, and then within a couple of days, that person would die, usually inexplicably. It was like a harbinger of doom that these dreams represented who was gonna die next. And so every time she had this dream, she knew someone's gonna die. But in that last dream she had, the one, 5 days earlier that scared her so badly, she knew she couldn't tell Henrietta. In that dream, it was the first time she, Augusta, didn't perform the procedure, i.e. putting the rug over one of the holes. Those two men came over and they did it. And Augusta realized she's sitting with her feet in the other hole, and she's realizing she's in her daughter's basement. That's where this dream's taking place. This must mean she, Augusta, is next. And wouldn't you know it, just days after telling her daughter about this, within 2 weeks of having this dream, Augusta died of heart failure in her daughter's house.